Kim knew you'd take her. That was why it was safe. I froze outside the half-closed study door, my hand still wrapped around the coat I'd come back to grab. 18 years earlier, my sister had left her 4-year-old daughter on my doorstep for a few weeks. That little girl slept beside a packed backpack and asked me, night after night, "If I'm good, will Mom come back?" I raised her, loved her, adopted her, built my whole life around staying when everyone else left. Now, a billionaire grandmother had appeared, calling my daughter worthy of coming home. But the voices behind that door were talking about me like I had been part of the plan. And suddenly, I knew the abandonment hadn't started the day my sister walked away. 6 hours earlier, I had been standing in my kitchen arguing with a tray of baked ziti. It was the last Saturday in May. Warm enough that I had cracked the back windows, but not warm enough to trust Connecticut with the screen door. The house smelled like tomato sauce, garlic, lemon cleaner, and the vanilla cupcakes Avery had insisted we buy instead of letting me experiment with frosting again. I had 12 people coming for dinner after her college graduation and enough food for roughly 35. Avery came through the kitchen in her cap and gown, looked at the dining table, then at the foil pans covering half the counter. "Mom," she said, 12 people are coming. 12 college students. That is still 12. In terms of food consumption, it's a regional emergency." She gave me the look she had perfected somewhere around middle school, the one that said she loved me but did not endorse my methods. Then she stole a meatball from the cooling tray, burned 2 fingers, and swore under her breath. I slapped the back of her hand with a dish towel. "Future civil engineer. Structural engineers are not required to understand meatball thermodynamics. You majored in civil." "Exactly. Roads, bridges, not meatballs." I laughed before I could stop myself. It came out light, almost girlish. And for a second, the years folded in on themselves. Avery was 22, 5'7", dark hair pinned badly under a graduation cap she claimed was designed by people who hate skulls. But I could still see the child who used to sit cross-legged on the counter while I packed her school lunches. That was the danger of raising a child. Time became dishonest. It moved in years for everyone else, and in flashes for you. I had gone upstairs looking for a ribbon for her gift when I opened the hall closet and saw the backpack. It sat on the top shelf behind a folded beach blanket, small and faded, purple once but bleached to a tired lavender. A cracked unicorn smiled from the front pocket. One zipper still had a pink plastic star tied to it. My hand stopped in midair. For a moment, I could smell wet leaves and cold pavement instead of laundry detergent. September 2008. Kimberly standing in my doorway with Avery beside her. 1 suitcase, 1 backpack. My sister's face tight and shiny from crying, though later I would understand that fear and guilt can look a lot like grief when you want them to. "Just a few weeks," she had said. Avery had looked up at me without speaking. That first night, I made spaghetti because it was one of the only foods I knew she would eat. She took 3 bites. At bedtime, I put her suitcase in the guest room closet. She dragged it back out. The second night, she slept in her jeans with the backpack beside the bed. The fourth night, she moved it to the floor near the bedroom door. A week later, I found her asleep on top of the comforter wearing sneakers. When I finally asked why, she stared at the zipper on that ridiculous unicorn bag and whispered, "If I'm good, will Mom come back?" I remember exactly what my body did. My throat closed first. Then something hot climbed behind my eyes while my hands went cold. I sat down on the carpet because my knees suddenly felt unreliable. "You don't have to be good for me to stay," I told her. She didn't answer. At 4, she already knew adults could say beautiful things and still leave. Years later, when she was 10, she found that same backpack in the closet and announced it was hideous beyond repair. "It survived 3 schools, 2 broken zippers, and your glitter phase," I told her. "It has earned retirement." I had a glitter phase for 6 months. You had glitter in your hair for 2 years. That was environmental contamination. Even then, she had liked precise language. I touched the cracked unicorn with one finger, then closed the closet before the day could tilt too far backward. By noon, Avery and I were at the university, with thousands of other families pressed into folding chairs under white tents. The campus lawn was bright green, the kind of green that exists for about 3 weeks in Connecticut before summer burns the edges brown. Parents kept standing at the wrong times to take pictures. Someone 2 rows ahead of me had a balloon that slapped me in the face every time the wind changed. I did not care. When Avery's name was called, I stood so fast my folding chair snapped shut behind my legs. Avery Mitchell. She crossed the stage, accepted the folder, shook the dean's hand, and turned toward the crowd. For 1 second, she found me. Not the camera. Not her friends. Me. Her grin changed when our eyes met. It became smaller and more private. My kid did it. There are moments when pride is almost painful. It stretched across my chest until I had to press a hand against my sternum. I thought about parent-teacher conferences, braces, fevers, science fairs, panic over calculus, the terrible trumpet phase, her first driving lesson, every tuition payment that made me stare at my bank account and whisper numbers like prayer. Then my phone buzzed in my purse. Kimberly. Tell her I'm proud. That was it. No call. No, I wish I were there. No explanation. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. My sister had become very good at sending emotions by proxy. Congratulations. Birthdays. Christmas. She could transmit affection without allowing it to become an obligation. I typed, "She'd rather hear it from you." 3 dots appeared, then vanished. After the ceremony, Avery let me take exactly 9 photographs before declaring that her face had reached maximum parental documentation capacity. Her friends gathered around us, loud and sweaty and relieved. I was handing out bottled water when a delivery driver approached, carrying an arrangement so large it could have concealed a toddler. The card read, "Proud of you, Avery. The world needs builders." Dad. Avery read it, expression still. "He remembered my major," she said. The sentence was mild. That made it hurt worse. Andrew Prescott had never completely disappeared. Complete disappearance requires commitment. He preferred intermittent proof of life, an expensive birthday gift, a holiday email, a call every few months that often became a speech about how busy things had been. He had remarried years earlier. 2 younger children, a house in Westchester, school fundraisers, ski trips, family Christmas cards where everyone wore coordinated sweaters. Kimberly had remarried too. New husband, new son, a life in Massachusetts that somehow always contained enough chaos to make reaching Avery complicated. Both of them had built second families, while I was still explaining to a 6-year-old why her first family had stopped arriving. "Do you want me to put the flowers in the car?" I asked. Avery nodded. "They'll look good next to the ZD." I smiled because she wanted me to. Andrew appeared 40 minutes later. He came across the lawn in a pale blue shirt with the sleeves rolled once, expensive watch, no tie, looking exactly like a man who had left a board meeting early enough to be praised for trying. He was still handsome in the polished, non-threatening way that had once made my sister trust him. "Avery." She turned. He opened his arms, then hesitated just enough for her to notice. Avery stepped into the hug. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. "You look incredible," he said. "I'm wearing polyester in 80-degree weather. You know what I mean." He laughed too quickly. His eyes flicked to me. "Laura, Andrew." There had been a time when hearing his name could make my jaw ache from clenching. 18 years had worn the anger into something denser. Less fire. More stone. He asked Avery about her job offer. She corrected him when he named the wrong firm. He recovered smoothly, saying he had confused it with another company he had heard about. Then he said, "Mom's in Connecticut." Avery's shoulders changed. Barely. A half-inch higher. "Your mom?" I asked. Andrew nodded. "She wants to meet Avery." "After 22 years?" His mouth tightened. "It's complicated." Of course it was. Complicated had done a lot of work for that family. Avery looked at me, not asking permission. Checking my face, I forced my shoulders to loosen. "What do you want?" I asked her. She looked back at Andrew. "I want to know why now." He exhaled through his nose. "She'll explain that herself." That was the first moment the day stopped feeling entirely like ours. By 4, the graduation dinner had taken over my house. Shoes crowded the hall. Avery's friends had nearly finished the ziti, and I was cutting cake when a black sedan stopped outside. Conversation near the windows thinned as Evelyn Prescott stepped out. I knew her from Connecticut business profiles. The woman who had expanded the Prescott family's regional real estate business into a private empire of logistics, property, industrial development, and infrastructure. In person, she was smaller than I expected. 74. Silver hair at her jaw, cream jacket, plain gold watch, but she carried herself as if rooms were expected to make space for her. Andrew got out from the other side. Avery came to stand next to me. Evelyn stopped at the walkway and looked at her. Something changed in her face. Not softness exactly. Recognition. "Avery," she said. Avery folded her arms. "Mrs. Prescott." A flicker passed through Evelyn's eyes. "Evelyn will do. I'll work up to it." I nearly smiled. Evelyn did. That was the unsettling part. She looked pleased by resistance. Inside, I offered her coffee, because apparently my body had decided that hospitality was safer than screaming questions on the lawn. Evelyn declined and asked for water. Avery brought her a glass. Evelyn thanked her, then said, "You still favor your left knee when you stand too long." Every muscle along my back tightened. Avery stared at her. "What?" "The injury during your sophomore internship. You tore the meniscus." "It was a partial tear." "Yes. You chose physical therapy instead of surgery." Avery's face went still. I set the knife I was holding onto the counter, because suddenly I did not trust my grip. Evelyn continued as if discussing weather. She knew about Avery's senior design competition. She knew the name of the bridge rehabilitation proposal her team had worked on. She knew Avery had turned down an internship extension in New York the previous summer. "You would have done well there," Evelyn said. Avery's voice cooled. "How do you know I turned it down?" Evelyn glanced at me. "Because your mother had outpatient surgery that July." The kitchen seemed to shrink. Mine had been minor. Gallbladder. 2 nights of discomfort and a week of moving carefully. Avery had refused to leave me alone, even though I had told her, repeatedly, that I was perfectly capable of heating soup. I had never met Evelyn Prescott. I had never spoken to Evelyn Prescott. "How do you know that?" I asked. She took a sip of water. "I make it a point to know what concerns my family." My stomach turned. Avery set both palms on the back of a dining chair. "You haven't been my family?" Evelyn did not flinch. "No," she said. "I haven't earned that word." It was the first thing she said that I respected. Then she ruined it. "But I believe there are reasons you should understand before deciding whether that remains true." An hour later, after Avery's friends had left, and the kitchen had been reduced to towers of foil-wrapped leftovers, Kimberly called. "Not Avery. Me." Her voice was already defensive. "I heard Evelyn went there." "You heard fast," Andrew called. "Of course he did." Kim exhaled sharply. "Laura, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." I leaned against the sink and watched Avery through the back window. She was carrying folding chairs into the garage 2 at a time, because apparently asking for help remained illegal in her private constitution. Harder for who? For Avery. The answer came too quickly. I laughed once. "No humor in it. You don't get to use her name like that. Silence. Then Kimberly's voice changed. Softer, almost wounded. I knew you'd do this. Do what? Turn everything into evidence that I'm a terrible person. My fingers tightened around the phone. You left a 4-year-old with me for a few weeks and built a new life. I did not disappear. You missed kindergarten graduation, birthdays, visits you promised. Every time there was a reason. You know what those years were like. I know exactly what they were like. I was there. Kimberly went quiet. That landed because it was true. Then she said, Avery was better with you. There it was. The sentence she had polished for 18 years. You always knew how to handle things, she continued. You had the stable job, the house, the routines. You wanted to take care of her. I wanted her safe. You wanted her. The heat left my hands so fast the phone felt slippery. Kimberly spoke carefully now, each word placed where she knew it would cut. You adopted her, Laura. You built your life around her. Don't stand there now and act like I stole 18 years from you. For a second, I could not breathe. The kitchen lights buzzed overhead. Water dripped somewhere in the sink. Through the glass, Avery laughed at something one of her friends had shouted from the driveway. I looked at her and thought about the first year she lived with me, when she apologized if she spilled milk, the way she asked permission to open the refrigerator, the way she once hid a broken crayon because she thought I might send her away for ruining it. You don't get to turn what I did after you left into permission for you to leave, I said. Kimberly's breath caught. Then she hardened again. Just don't sabotage this because you're scared she might choose something bigger than you. The call ended before I could answer. That sentence followed me all the way to Greenwich. Avery agreed to go because she wanted answers. I went because she asked me to. The Prescott estate sat behind stone walls and old trees on a rise above Long Island Sound. It was not flashy. Flashy tries to impress you. This place assumed you already knew what it cost. A staff member took our coats. Evelyn said, "This is Laura Mitchell, Avery's aunt and adoptive mother." The words were legally accurate. They still struck me wrong. Adoptive mother. As if mother needed an asterisk. I felt Avery's fingers brush mine once, quick and deliberate. She had heard it too. Andrew was waiting in the drawing room. He poured himself mineral water and began talking about how good it was that everyone was finally in the same room. We all made mistakes, he said. I looked at him. Did Avery? His face tightened. That's not what I meant. I know. Evelyn cut across us before he could start explaining. We did not ask you here to relitigate the divorce. No, I said. You waited 18 years. Avery touched my wrist. Not to silence me, to steady me. That was enough. Evelyn led us into a smaller room where a woman from Prescott Council had arranged folders at each seat. The conversation that followed was polished enough to make coercion sound like opportunity. Avery, Evelyn explained, had been named in the Prescott family trust at birth, under language that preserved her beneficiary status, even if custody, adoption, or surname later changed. Her college graduation and 22nd year were the threshold Evelyn had chosen for an adult governance review. The trust did not make her an executive and did not promise her a corporate job. What Evelyn was offering was entry into a 90-day family governance integration process, meetings with trustees, education on ownership responsibilities, observation of family governance, and evaluation for a long-term role as a future family representative. Avery listened without interrupting. Then Evelyn added the house, a property near Greenwich, roughly $5 million, owned personally by Evelyn. If Avery chose to proceed, and the process went as Evelyn hoped, she intended to transfer it. My pulse began beating in my throat. $5 million. My house in Milford still had a mortgage. I hated that my mind made the comparison. I hated it even more because some frightened, private part of me whispered that Avery deserved things I could never give her. Space, security, connections. A world where an unexpected medical bill did not require rearranging a year. For one ugly second, I wondered whether love had simply been the best thing available until something better arrived. Then Evelyn looked at Avery and said, "You've spent 18 years proving what kind of woman you are. Now you can decide whether you're ready to come home." Home. The word went through me like cold metal. I saw a purple backpack on a bedroom floor. A 4-year-old sleeping in sneakers. If I'm good, will Mom come back? Avery did not reach for anything. She sat very still. "I already have a home," she said. Evelyn's expression barely changed. "I'm not asking you to deny that." It sounded reasonable. That made it worse. The lawyer slid another folder toward me. Family Reconciliation Framework. I read the first page, then the second. By the third, my jaw hurt. They offered to pay the remaining mortgage on my house as recognition of long-term caregiving. There were confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions regarding private family matters. A paragraph asked me to acknowledge that no Prescott family member had actively prevented reunification. Another stated that I would not interfere with Avery's integration meetings or governance evaluation unless invited. I looked up. "Are you paying me for raising her?" The lawyer began to answer. Evelyn lifted one finger. "No, we are acknowledging what you carried." You put a number beside it. Numbers are how institutions recognize obligations. She's my daughter. I am aware. The calmness in her voice made my skin prickle. Avery pushed the folder away from me. "She's not signing anything tonight." I looked at her. Evelyn did too. Again, that strange flash of approval. "Good," Evelyn said. "She shouldn't." I could not tell whether she meant me or Avery. By the time we stood to leave, my body felt as if I had spent 3 hours holding a heavy box against my chest. My shoulders burned. My head had begun to ache behind one eye. Avery and Andrew were still talking near the foyer when I realized I had left my coat on the back of a chair in the smaller sitting room. "I'll get it," I said. I walked back alone. The house was quieter away from the front rooms. My heels made almost no sound on the runner. As I passed the study, I heard Andrew's voice. I would have kept walking if I had not heard my last name. Mitchell was always the stable variable. I stopped. The study door was half closed. A woman answered him. I recognized the voice of the senior family office administrator, who had sat in during part of the meeting. That assessment was 18 years ago. My hand found the wall. Andrew sounded strained. And she was never supposed to know about it. The woman lowered her voice, but the hallway carried enough. "Mrs. Prescott was right." She held, not stayed, not loved Avery, held, like a bridge under load, like a beam tested for failure. My heartbeat turned hard and uneven. Andrew said something I missed. Then the woman answered clearly. Kim knew Laura would take her. That was why the contingency worked. My fingers went numb around the edge of my coat. For 18 years, I had believed one ugly thing, that my sister had failed, panicked, chosen herself, and left me to catch the child falling out of her life. Standing outside that study, I realized there might have been something worse than abandonment. Someone had expected me to catch her. That thought followed me out of the Prescott house like a second shadow. I do not remember putting my coat on. I remember the weight of it over my arm, the cold metal of the front door handle against my palm, and Avery looking at me from beside the foyer table with a question already forming in her face. I must have answered it somehow because she did not press me there. Andrew was still standing a few feet away, pretending to check something on his phone. Evelyn was nowhere in sight. The drive back to Milford should have taken under an hour. It felt longer. Avery sat beside me with her graduation dress folded across her knees and her shoes kicked off on the floor mat. The car was quiet, except for the low hum of the highway and the occasional click of the turn signal. Twice she looked over at me. "You're gripping the wheel like it owes you money." I loosened my hands. The skin across my knuckles was white. I'm fine. She waited. That was another thing she had learned too young. Sometimes "I'm fine" was not a statement. It was a closed door. She looked back through the windshield. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to pull the car onto the shoulder and say, "They knew. They knew I would take you. They talked about me before you ever came to my house. Your grandmother had some kind of assessment. Your father knew. Your mother knew enough to trust that I would catch you." But I had heard less than a minute of conversation through a half-closed door. 1 minute was not enough to blow up 18 years of a person's life. So I kept driving. By the time we got home, my shoulders ached from holding myself so tightly. Avery went upstairs, saying she needed a shower, and 20 consecutive minutes where nobody had a trust document. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the foil-covered remains of the graduation dinner. Yesterday, the mess would have made me smile. Now the room felt contaminated. Kimberly had known I would take her. That was why the contingency worked. The word contingency sat wrong in my head. People used contingency for backup generators and weather plans, not children. I waited until I heard Avery's shower start. Then I called my sister. Kimberly answered on the 4th ring. "Hey." Her voice was cautious. I went straight at it. "Did anyone from the Prescott family investigate me before you left Avery with me?" "Nothing. Not even breathing." I stood at the kitchen island with one hand flat on the counter. The granite was cool under my palm. "Kim, what are you talking about? Did anyone investigate me?" "That's a weird word." My jaw tightened. "Then give me a better one." She exhaled. "Andrew's family had lawyers. There were background checks. Everybody knew that." "Everybody? You know what I mean?" "No, I don't." My heart had begun beating faster, not from surprise but from recognition. This was how Kimberly fought when she knew the facts were bad. She attacked the wording first. I lowered my voice. "I heard Andrew tonight." The silence changed. It became alert. "What did you hear?" "That there was an assessment of me 18 years ago." "Laura, that you knew I'd take Avery." She did not say that was false. My stomach dropped. Instead, she said, "Of course I knew you'd take her." The sentence was so casual I almost missed what she had done. "You're my sister," she continued. "You loved Avery. You were the safest person she had." "That isn't what I asked." "Then what are you asking?" "I'm asking whether you came to my house with that suitcase because you had already been told I would be the easiest person to leave her with. That is insane." There it was. Not no. Insane. A tiny pulse began behind my right eye. I closed my eyes. "Did Evelyn Prescott know you were bringing Avery to me?" "I don't know what Evelyn knew." "Did Andrew?" "He knew Avery was with you. Before or after?" Kimberly sighed the way people sigh when they want your question to become embarrassing. "Laura, it was 18 years ago. We were getting divorced. Everything was happening at once. That is not an answer. I had no money of my own. Andrew was moving back toward his family. The lawyers were talking about custody and schedules and schools, and Avery was 4 years old and barely sleeping. You were stable." The word made my skin go cold. Stable. Not loving. Not her aunt. Stable. I opened my eyes. "Who told you I was stable?" She hesitated. That was enough. I could hear a television in the background at her house. A man laughed faintly. Her husband, probably. The life she had built after leaving the first one behind. Kim. His lawyers asked questions, she finally said, about where Avery could stay if things got messy. "When?" "I don't remember." "Before you brought her to me?" I said I don't remember. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the island until it hurt. She slept with a backpack by the door. Kimberly's breath came out fast. "Don't." She wore sneakers to bed because she thought she might miss you if you came back. "I know what happened." Do you? I was falling apart. And she was 4. She was safe with you. You keep saying that like it absolves you. Her voice sharpened. I am not asking for absolution. No. You're asking me to call abandonment a safety plan. Stop using that word. It startled me. The same thing Evelyn had done. Be careful with that word. Abandoned. My pulse kicked hard once in my throat. Why does everyone in that family hate that word so much? Kimberly went quiet. Then she said, because it's not the whole story. I leaned forward. What is the whole story? But she had already retreated. You're upset. You heard part of something, and now you're connecting dots that probably aren't connected. You could fix that in one sentence. What? Tell me no one assessed me before you decided to leave Avery with me. Silence. My hand went numb against the countertop. Kimberly's voice softened after several seconds. You were the one person I trusted. It was almost beautiful. That was what made it cruel. I let out a short breath. So that's your answer. My answer is that I knew you would keep her safe. For a few weeks? That was what I thought. For 18 years? Don't do this. For 18 years, Kim. You adopted her. My back went rigid. At 7, you wanted that adoption. I wanted her to stop wondering whether she could be taken away every time you changed your mind. You see, she snapped. This is exactly what I mean. You made a choice too. At some point this stopped being something I did to you and became the life you chose. The words slid under my ribs. For 1 second I could not speak. I looked toward the ceiling, toward the room where Avery was showering. Then I said, very quietly, you do not get to use the fact that I stayed as proof that leaving was acceptable. Kimberly inhaled. I ended the call before she could turn that into something else. My hand shook for nearly a minute afterward. I put the phone down and pressed both palms against the counter until the trembling slowed. Then I called Andrew. He answered immediately. Laura, you knew I was calling. A pause. I figured you might. What was the assessment? He did not ask what assessment. That hurt more than I expected. I sat down. Andrew. It was a contingency review. The word landed exactly where I knew it would. What does that mean? During the divorce, there were questions about where Avery would stay, if Kim's housing situation changed. She was still your daughter. I know. Do you? My voice cracked on the second word. I hated that. He heard it. His tone became gentler, which made me angrier. Laura, I'm not trying to fight with you. Then answer me. He exhaled. My mother's family office looked at possible stable placements. That's all. That's all. At the time, everything was uncertain. Was I one of those placements before Kimberly came to my house? Another pause. My pulse beat against my ears. Yes. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the edge of the chair. How long before? I don't remember exactly. Try. Maybe a few weeks. A few weeks. I stared at the wall. A few weeks before Kimberly stood in my doorway crying and asking me for a favor, people I had never met had already opened a file on me. What did they look at? Basic things? What things? Employment? Housing? Criminal history? Whether you had a relationship with Avery? Who gave them permission? It wasn't some secret surveillance operation. That isn't what I asked. You're making this sound darker than it was. Again, the wording, the correction, the slow sanding down of reality. I could feel heat rising into my face. So, help me understand it correctly. He went quiet. Did you know your mother had identified me as the person most likely to keep Avery? Yes. Did Kimberly know? She knew you were considered the safest option. I closed my eyes. The kitchen disappeared. All I could see was my front porch in 2008. Kimberly holding a suitcase, Avery holding that backpack. A few weeks, just until I get myself together, I swallowed. Why didn't you take her? Andrew's voice changed. That's not fair. I laughed. A dry, ugly sound. Not fair? I was fighting with my mother. Kim and I were fighting. The divorce was getting worse. My mother thought stability mattered more than moving Avery between houses. And what did you think? I thought she was safe with you. There it was again. The family anthem. Safe with you. As if my competence had removed their obligation. You built another family. His breathing changed. Laura, you remarried. You had more kids. You became a father in another house. That doesn't mean I stopped caring about Avery. No, it just means caring was the part you kept after you gave away the work. He said nothing. I stood up because sitting suddenly felt impossible. What exactly did Evelyn want from this? I don't know what you mean. She doesn't do anything casually. That's your assumption. She had an assessment of me before Avery came through my door. It was risk management. For a child? For a custody situation. Then why was someone tonight calling me a variable? Silence. Longer this time. Andrew's voice came back low. You should talk to my mother. The answer frightened me more than if he had denied everything. I hung up. For several minutes, I stood in the kitchen listening to the refrigerator cycle. On and off. Then Avery came downstairs. Her hair was wet. She wore an old university sweatshirt and shorts, and she looked younger without the graduation makeup. She stopped when she saw me. What happened? I turned toward the sink. Nothing I can prove yet. That answer made her still. Not nothing. Not I'm fine. Something I could not prove. She came closer. Is this about them? Yes. Do I need to know now? I looked at her. There are moments when loving someone means telling them everything. There are other moments when it means not handing them your fear until you know whether it is real. I need one day, I said. Maybe less. She studied me, then nodded. One day. No argument, no demand. That trust hurt almost as much as the secret. I barely slept. By 6 the next morning I had coffee, legal pads, and 3 banker boxes spread across the dining table. I had kept everything. Not because I was sentimental. Because for the first 3 years of raising Avery, paperwork had been the only thing standing between me and panic. Temporary guardianship orders, school authorization forms, pediatric records, adoption correspondence, copies of letters from Kimberly, emails from Andrew, probate court notices, receipts for fees I had forgotten paying, a binder labeled Avery Legal that I had not opened in years. I worked chronologically. September 2008. Temporary authority. October. Family counselor referral. November. Guardianship hearing. January 2009. Formalized guardianship. The guardianship never lapsed. In 2011, Kimberly and Andrew signed the consents that allowed the probate court to terminate their parental rights and finalize my relative adoption of Avery. The papers calmed me because they were ordinary dates, signatures, stamps. Reality had edges when it was printed. Then I found the first reference. A letter from my attorney dated the 3rd of October 2008. We have received confirmation from Prescott Council that their household suitability materials will not be submitted unless placement is contested. I read it twice. Household suitability materials. At the time, I must have assumed that meant whatever background paperwork rich people generated when they panicked. Now the phrase looked like a door. I flipped backward. Nothing. Forward. A billing statement from my attorney. Review correspondence suitability file reference PM08441. My skin prickled. I wrote the code down. Then I found an old fax cover sheet from Prescott Council, dated September 9. Kimberly had brought Avery to my house on September 18. 9 days earlier. The attachment line said, Re. Mitchell Household Review. Supplemental reference confirmation. I sat back hard enough that the chair creaked. My mouth had gone dry. 9 days before my sister arrived on my porch, someone had already named a document after my household. I stared at the page until the black letters blurred. Avery came downstairs around 8 and stopped at the doorway. You look like you're doing taxes for a small country. Close. She came over with her coffee and looked at the boxes. I turned the fax cover face down before she could read it. She noticed. Of course she noticed, but she kept her promise. One day, she reminded me. I know. She squeezed my shoulder. Her hand stayed there for half a second longer than usual. Then she left for breakfast with a friend. The second piece came from the counselor records. Not therapy notes. Status summaries. The counselor had been brought in during the custody mess because Avery was not sleeping, eating badly, and panicking whenever adults left rooms without telling her. I found the release form. Kimberly's signature. Andrew's signature. Limited authorization for custody and guardianship status updates to legal counsel and both parents. My chest tightened. So they had been allowed to know. I did not yet know what they had read. But the root existed. That mattered. By 11, I had stopped feeling shocked. Shock is bright. What replaced it was colder. Method. I made a timeline. Assessment reference before Avery arrived. Formal guardianship afterward. Counselor updates distributed to both parents. Adoption petition. 3 years later. It was not proof of a conspiracy, but it was proof that the story I had been told in 2008 was incomplete. At noon, Avery's phone buzzed on the counter. She had left it charging. Mine rang seconds later. Evelyn. I almost let it go, then answered. Laura. Her voice was as calm as yesterday. Avery has a meeting with the independent trustee this afternoon. I would like you both here. For what? An integration acknowledgement. Nothing binding. I looked at the papers spread across my table. Will your family office be there? A pause small enough most people would miss. Yes, I'll come. Avery gave me a look when I told her. You sure? No. Great. Very confidence-inspiring. Despite everything, I smiled. Get your shoes. The Prescott estate looked different in daylight. Less mysterious. More organized. That was worse. The same woman from the study the night before met us near the main hall. She introduced herself properly this time as Caroline Voss, Senior Administrator for the Prescott Family Office, Stable Variable. She smiled like she had never said it. Avery went with the trustee and counsel into a conference room. I was told I could wait in the study. The irony almost made me laugh. Caroline came in carrying 2 binders and a stack of archive folders. She set them on a side table, checked her phone, then frowned. I'm sorry. I need to confirm which room counsel wants these in. She stepped out. I stayed seated for perhaps 10 seconds. Then I saw the spine of the top binder. AP, Placement and Development. 2008, 2011. Every muscle in my body tightened. Do not touch it. That was the first thought. The second was the fax code on my dining table. PM 08441. I stood. My legs felt strangely light. I crossed the room. The binder was thick, old enough that the black vinyl had begun to crack near the rings. I opened it. The first pages were indexes. Custody. Placement. Household reviews. Development. I turned one page, then another, and saw my name. Laura Mitchell Household Suitability Assessment. My stomach dropped so violently I had to grip the edge of the table. The date was the 28th of August 2008. 3 weeks before Avery arrived. I stared at it. 3 weeks. I started reading. Employment. Stable. Residence. Owner. Occupied. Mortgage within documented range. Criminal. Public record. No concerns identified. Family relationship to minor. Maternal aunt. Frequent contact. Observed. Confirmed attachment. High. Routine reliability. High. Likelihood of accepting temporary placement, if requested. High. My pulse climbed. I turned the page. A section titled Placement Considerations. Preferred contingency placement. Laura Mitchell. Stable attachment figure. Low dependency on Prescott resources. Low anticipated disruption to child's school and daily routine. My hands began to shake. Not dramatically. Small, fast tremors through my fingertips. I pulled out my phone, photographed the page. Then another. I knew photos of a binder would never be enough to prove anything by themselves. But right then, I was not building a case. I was trying to prove to myself I had not imagined the last 18 hours. The next memo was shorter. Contingency planning note. If placement occurs, caregiver financial support should remain minimal unless household stability is materially threatened. I stopped breathing. Remain minimal. Not provide support. Remain minimal. As if a decision had already been made about how much help I should or should not receive while raising someone else's child. At the bottom were handwritten initials. E.P. I knew whose they were. My skin went cold from my scalp down to my arms. There was another line. Preserve ordinary environment. Avoid creating Prescott dependency. I read it again. Then again. A sound in the hallway. Footsteps. Measured. Coming closer. My heart slammed once against my ribs. I closed the binder too quickly, almost catching my finger in the rings. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I locked my phone. The study door opened. Evelyn Prescott stood there. Her eyes went first to my face, then to the binder under my hand. No surprise. No panic. No anger. Just a stillness that made my stomach tighten. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. That file, she said quietly, was never meant for you. My mouth had gone dry. I kept my hand on the cover because, if I let go, I was afraid she would see it shaking. Was I chosen before she was abandoned? For the first time since I had met her, Evelyn's expression changed. Not guilt, not fear, something colder. Correction. Be very careful with that word, Laura. I stared at her. She had not objected to chosen, only abandoned. Evelyn and I stood on opposite sides of the study table with the binder between us, and for several seconds neither of us moved. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint tick of a clock somewhere behind me. Be very careful with that word, Laura. Abandoned. She had corrected the word, not the accusation. My pulse was still running too fast from being caught, but something inside me had gone strangely calm. Fear can do that when it gets too large. It stops feeling like panic and starts feeling like a surface you can stand on. I looked down at the binder, then back at her. I'm trying to understand. That is not what you are doing. Her voice was quiet, controlled, almost disappointed. It reminded me of a principal addressing a student who had opened the wrong filing cabinet. I could have pushed harder. I wanted to. I wanted to ask why there had been an assessment before Kimberly brought Avery to my door, why someone had decided I should receive minimal support, why my life had been reduced to phrases like stable attachment and low dependency on Prescott resources. Instead, I let my shoulders drop. It took effort. I reacted. I said. Evelyn watched me. I made myself look embarrassed. Not broken. Broken would have been too obvious. Just ashamed of having crossed a line in a house where everyone seemed to have been trained to make boundaries look like natural law. I heard part of a conversation last night, I continued. Then I found old references in my guardianship files this morning. I saw the binder and assumed the worst. Did you? The question was so flat, it almost made me smile. I assumed there had been some plan to push Avery onto me. Evelyn's face did not change. There was a contingency plan. And I was the contingency. You were one of the options considered. That file says preferred. A tiny pause. I had gone one sentence too far. So I stepped back again. But if the purpose was to make sure Avery had somewhere safe during the divorce, then maybe I am reading intent into something that was just risk management. That did it. Not completely, but enough. Evelyn's shoulders loosened by maybe half an inch. She moved around the table and closed the binder properly, smoothing one hand over the black cover. Andrew's marriage was unstable. Kimberly's housing was uncertain. Avery was 4 years old. Responsible adults prepare for instability. Responsible adults. My teeth pressed together behind my lips. I nodded. Was Andrew part of that decision? Yes. Kimberly. She was aware that you were considered a safe placement. Aware. The family loved passive verbs. I tucked that away. Evelyn picked up the binder. You need to understand something else. I waited. She looked toward the windows, where afternoon light lay cleanly over the lawn. My son was given every advantage a parent could provide. The best schools, access, protection from consequences. Every door opened before he reached it. There was no tenderness in the way she said son, only appraisal. And you think that ruined him? She looked at me. I think comfort can become a narcotic. The sentence was practiced. Maybe she had said it to Boards. Maybe to Andrew. Maybe to herself. Avery did not grow up comfortable, I said. No. She grew up abandoned. Evelyn's eyes sharpened. I corrected myself before she could. She grew up without the Prescott world. That is accurate. My skin crawled at the approval in her voice. She continued. She learned to work. She learned to recover. She learned that effort has weight. Do you know how rare that is among people born into families like mine? Probably less rare than you think. One corner of her mouth moved. For a second, she looked almost amused. Then she surprised me. She set the binder down again, crossed to a writing desk near the window, and opened a shallow drawer. From it she removed a newspaper clipping, sealed in a clear protective sleeve. She handed it to me. The headline was from a local education section. A blurry photograph showed a much younger Avery standing beside 3 classmates and a model bridge made from balsa wood. She was 14. I remembered that project. I remembered driving to a hardware store at 9:30 at night because one of the support pieces had snapped. I remembered Avery crying in the parking lot because she thought she had ruined the whole thing. Evelyn had kept the clipping. Not photocopied. Kept. She was already thinking structurally, Evelyn said. I looked at her hand. Her fingers stayed on the edge of the sleeve, a fraction longer than necessary. That unsettled me more than the file, because it meant this was not indifference. She cared, maybe deeply. The question was, what kind of love watches a child from a distance and calls the distance useful? I gave the clipping back. She was 14. I know. You could have met her. Evelyn slid the clipping into the drawer. That would have changed the environment. There it was. A phrase so cold, I almost missed how terrible it was. My stomach tightened. I kept my face neutral. I think I need time. That is reasonable. She picked up the binder. What you do not need is to turn incomplete records into a morality play. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, I understand. I hated how easily the words came. But the second I said them, Evelyn believed something she had not believed 5 minutes earlier, that I could be managed. It was the first useful thing she had given me. When I returned to the front of the house, Avery was waiting near the entry table with her arms folded. You were gone a while. I got lost. In a hallway? This place has more square footage than common sense. She studied me. I could see the question in her face. I was not ready to answer it in front of the walls that belonged to Evelyn Prescott. Later, I said. Avery nodded once. On the drive home, she did not push me. She turned the radio low and watched traffic. That restraint made me feel worse. By the time we reached Milford, I had decided one thing. I was done asking the Prescott family to explain itself. The next morning, an email arrived from Prescott Council. Family Reconciliation Framework. Revised draft. I opened it at the kitchen table before work. The document was 32 pages long. 32. Nobody needed 32 pages to say thank you for raising a child. The revised version was cleaner than the first, which made it more dangerous. The mortgage offer was framed as a caregiving recognition payment. There was a broader confidentiality clause. A non-disparagement section covered historical family disputes. Another paragraph asked me to acknowledge that no Prescott family member had deliberately obstructed reunification between Avery and her biological parents. That sentence stopped me. I read it 3 times. No Prescott family member had deliberately obstructed reunification. Not nobody abandoned her. Not nobody stayed away. Just nobody obstructed reunification. Lawyer language had a talent for creating tiny islands of truth inside oceans of deception. The next section stated that, during Avery's 90-day integration, I agreed not to interfere with governance meetings, trustee interviews, or family office evaluations unless specifically invited. I leaned back in the chair. My coffee had gone cold. The document was not trying to take Avery from me. She was 22. Nobody could. It was trying to define the story before the story could be examined. If I signed, 18 years of absence became a tragic but mutually accepted family arrangement. My mortgage became compensation. My silence became closure. My phone rang. Kimberly, I almost let it go, then answered. Did you get the new agreement? That was her opening. Not hello. Not how is Avery. The lawyers copied you? Andrew told me. Of course. She made an impatient sound. Laura, I really think you should take the mortgage payoff. I looked around my kitchen. The cabinets were original. One drawer only closed if you lifted it before pushing. There was a water stain near the back door I kept meaning to repaint. I loved that room. Not because it was beautiful. Because Avery had done homework at that table. Because she had learned to make pancakes at that stove. Because every inch of it had been paid for with ordinary work. You think I should let them pay me for raising your daughter? She's your daughter. You make sure everyone knows that. Interesting time to agree with me. That's not what I meant. What did you mean? Kimberly sighed. I mean, you sacrificed a lot. My jaw tightened. You keep discovering that now that someone rich is offering to reimburse me. That's unfair. No, Kim. Unfair was me choosing between a school trip deposit and fixing the water heater while you were posting pictures from Cabo. That trip was years ago. Exactly. Silence. Then she said, You always do this. Do what? Keep a ledger. I stared at the document. I kept receipts because I was raising a child alone. I was not asking for a financial audit of my life. No, you're asking me to sign one of mine. She exhaled sharply. Maybe for once stop making suffering your personality. The sentence hit cleanly. My hand went still on the page. Kimberly knew me well enough to know where to aim. There had been years when I wondered whether I had become too attached to being the capable one, the one who stayed, the one who did not need help. What if I had built an identity out of endurance? Because it was the only thing nobody could take from me. The thought hurt because it contained just enough truth to be dangerous. Kimberly kept going. You got Avery. You got a family. She loves you. You adopted her. Nobody is taking that away. Why are you determined to make every good thing come with a funeral? I swallowed. Because you keep calling the funeral a good thing. She went silent. I ended the call. For several minutes I sat there looking at the signature block. Then I forwarded the document to a local civil attorney I had used once for an employment issue and asked for a review. I was not a lawyer. I was not going to become one because a billionaire had entered my life. At work, I tried to concentrate on summer registration schedules, vendor invoices, and a staffing problem in the advising office. Normal problems felt almost luxurious. At lunch, I opened the photographs I had taken from the binder. One name appeared in the footer of several pages. Martin Keene, Director, Compliance. Next to one handwritten note was a mark. MK objected. Personal purpose. I searched public records first. Martin had left the Prescott family office 11 years earlier. He now ran a small compliance consulting practice out of New Haven County. I stared at the number on his website for 5 minutes before calling. A receptionist answered. I gave my name. There was a pause after she repeated it. Then a man came on. Laura Mitchell? Yes. His voice changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. How did you get this number? It's on your website. That is not what I meant. My stomach tightened. I found your name on a Prescott document. Silence. What document? Candidate development. Another pause. I heard a chair move on his end. What code? I looked at the photo. CD. 4. He did not say anything for so long. I checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Finally, he said, Do not email me anything. I wasn't planning to. Do not text it. Okay. Can you meet tomorrow morning? Yes. There's a diner off Route 10 inches Hamden, 8 o'clock. Why there? Because nobody in my old life eats breakfast there. He hung up. The next morning I arrived 10 minutes early. The diner smelled like coffee, bacon, and industrial lemon cleaner. A waitress with silver hair pointed me toward a booth near the back. Martin Keene was already there. He looked nothing like the man I had imagined from the title, Director of Compliance. I had pictured someone severe. Martin wore an Old Navy sweater and reading glasses pushed up on his head. His coffee cup was half empty. A yellow legal pad sat face down beside his plate. He looked at me once, then at the door behind me. Did anyone follow you? I almost laughed. No. You sure? No one in my life has ever been interested enough to follow me. He did not smile. That told me the joke had landed in the wrong world. I sat down. The waitress came over. Coffee? Yes, please. Martin waited until she left. Tell me exactly what you found. I did not show him the photographs yet. I described the binder, the date, the assessment language. When I said preferred contingency placement, his eyes dropped to the table. When I said low dependency on Prescott resources, he closed them for 1 second. You remember that language? Yes. What was CD for? He looked toward the counter. Originally? Originally. He rubbed a thumb along the edge of his coffee cup. Candidate development. 4th revision. That sounds like a corporate training program. That is what it was supposed to be. The waitress returned and filled my cup. Martin waited until she walked away. The Prescotts have a family office. You know what that is? An office that manages rich people. That's one way to put it. Martin waited until the waitress moved away. He explained that candidate development had started as something ordinary for a wealthy family. Financial education, mentors, summer work, governance training. Then, Evelyn began treating resilience itself as something that could be measured. Her own childhood had been unstable. Her mother left when she was young. She moved among relatives, worked early, and came to believe hardship revealed character. Andrew, in her mind, was proof of what too much protection could produce. And Avery became the correction, I said. Martin did not answer right away. That was answer enough. He turned over his legal pad. Across the top were 4 old category codes. CD, OD, INT, OBS. Candidate development. Observation. Intervention. Behavioral observation. You were tracking children? Not when it began. His voice hardened. I objected when family office resources started being used for personal behavioral projects. That's the note you saw beside my initials. The waitress refilled our cups. Martin watched her walk away and muttered, "If a family invents enough acronyms, eventually everybody forgets they're talking about people." A breathless laugh escaped me despite myself. Then I asked the question that mattered. Was Avery one of those people? Yes. Was I? You were an environmental variable. The phrase landed harder than an insult because it sounded so routine to him. I put a printed photograph of the assessment on the table. Martin recognized the format, the coding, and Evelyn's initials. He warned me not to take anything to the press or threaten anyone. If I wanted records preserved, I needed the independent trustee and outside counsel, people who could compel the family office to answer without turning the whole matter into a private feud. What can they actually do? Preserve records, review conflicts, and take Evelyn out of matters where the trust or family office has independent authority. The corporate board is separate. Don't treat all Prescott power like one box. I nodded, then asked, "What did she do to Avery?" Martin looked toward the diner entrance. If Evelyn has come back into Avery's life, the important question is what she is doing now. Cold moved across my arms. Then tell me enough to keep her safe. He wrote one phrase on the legal pad. Intervention minimum necessary. He said Evelyn did not believe in rescuing people from ordinary hardship, but she did not tolerate uncontrolled failure either. If a candidate's path drifted too far from the outcome she considered valuable, she intervened sometimes with money, sometimes with a connection, sometimes by allowing a difficulty to remain because she believed removing it would weaken the lesson. People aren't thermostats, I said. I know. Did she watch Avery struggle? Yes. Did she help? Sometimes. When the trajectory was at risk. I thought of scholarships that appeared at exactly the right moment. A summer program we nearly could not afford. Opportunities I had thanked luck for and moved past. Martin would not claim knowledge he did not have. He had left years earlier. But one thing he would say plainly, Evelyn had not merely observed. If you found the placement file, he said, tapping the words on the pad, you found the room she put Avery in. You haven't found the hand on the thermostat. For the rest of that morning, the phrase followed me everywhere. The hand on the thermostat. It sat beside me in the car. It came into the grocery store with me while I stood in front of a wall of cereal and realized I had no memory of driving there. It waited in the passenger seat when I came back out with milk, coffee, and nothing else I had actually gone in to buy. By the time I reached home, the fear had changed shape. At first, I had wanted to know whether Evelyn had watched Avery struggle. Now, I wanted to know something worse. Had she decided exactly how much struggling was useful? Avery was at the kitchen table with her laptop open and 2 job onboarding forms spread beside it. She glanced up when I came in. You look terrible. Thank you. I meant spiritually. That helps. She smiled, but only for a second. I set the grocery bag down and looked at her. I had promised myself I would stop treating her like a child who needed information, rationed for her own protection. That did not mean dumping every suspicion in her lap before I knew what was real. So I told her enough. I told her Martin Keene had confirmed that the family office once used something called candidate development. I told her he believed Evelyn had allowed certain hardships to continue and may have intervened selectively. I told her I did not yet know which parts of Avery's life had been touched. She did not interrupt. That scared me more than anger would have. When I finished, she closed her laptop. So I was a project. I don't know that. You just said candidate development. I said I found a program with that name. Mom, the single word stopped me. Not because she raised her voice, because she did not. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat. I'm trying very hard not to tell you what I think before I can prove it. I know. You deserve facts. I know. Her fingers rested flat on the table. She had always done that when she was trying to keep them from fidgeting. What did Martin say? That Evelyn hates randomness. Avery gave a short, humorless laugh. That sounds healthy. He said if someone's path moved too far from the outcome she wanted, she adjusted it. Avery's eyes shifted toward the window. For a moment, I could see her searching backward through her own life. Scholarships, jobs, teachers, programs, people who had said yes. I hated myself for giving her that habit. I hated Evelyn more for making the questions reasonable. "What do we do?" Avery asked. "Not what are you going to do. We." I took a breath. "We don't accuse her yet." That got her attention. "Okay. We ask her to prove she's right." Avery stared at me. Then slowly she understood. Her mouth tightened. "You want her to certify I did all of this without Prescott help. I want her to want to certify it." Avery leaned back. "And if she refuses? Then we learn something. And if she signs? Then we learn more." Avery looked at me for a long time. "That is the most passive-aggressive thing you have ever said. I raised you in Connecticut. It's cultural." Avery laughed. A real one this time. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it loosened something in my chest. 2 days later, we were back in Greenwich. The succession integration meeting took place in a conference room at the Prescott family office, not at the estate. That mattered. The room was not designed to impress. It was designed to document. A long table, glass walls, no family portraits, no antique clocks, just water, legal pads, screens, and people whose entire careers seemed to depend on knowing when a sentence had consequences. The independent trustees representative, a woman named Dana Whitmore, explained the process first. Avery was not being considered for a job. She was entering a long-term family governance track. The review would cover beneficiary education, ownership responsibilities, conflicts, privacy consent, and whether any family member had materially shaped her independence in a way that should be disclosed before she was described as self-made within the succession framework. That last phrase was mine. I had sent it to Avery's counsel the day before and suggested she ask for it. Evelyn sat at the far end of the table, one hand resting on a closed folder. She did not look irritated. She looked interested. That was exactly what I needed. Dana explained that any sponsor or controlling family representative who had provided material assistance, arranged undisclosed opportunities, or influenced a candidate's developmental record had to disclose it. Not because assistance was wrong, because hidden assistance made the evaluation meaningless. Avery listened. Andrew shifted once in his chair. Evelyn did not. When Dana finished, she asked whether anyone had concerns about formalizing that disclosure. I spoke before I could lose my nerve. "I do." Every face turned toward me. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. I kept my voice level. "If Avery is going to be introduced to this family as someone who succeeded without Prescott privilege, I want that fact protected." Andrew looked confused. Evelyn did not. I continued. "She worked for what she has. If this process is serious, no one should be able to say later that she was chosen because she's Evelyn Prescott's granddaughter." Dana nodded. "That is one purpose of this certification." I looked directly at Evelyn. "If you believe her independence is the reason she belongs in this process, then an independent review should help you." Silence. There are people who become cautious when challenged. Evelyn became taller. Not literally, but something in her posture changed. Pride has its own anatomy. She placed both hands on the folder. "I agree." Andrew turned toward her. "Mom, we may want to—" "No." Evelyn did not look at him. "If Avery is to have legitimacy, there should be no ambiguity." Dana asked again. "Then you are comfortable certifying, to the best of your knowledge, that no undisclosed Prescott intervention materially shaped Avery's education, employment, housing, or financial trajectory?" Evelyn's gaze stayed on me. "Yes." My pulse jumped, not because I had won, because she had stepped exactly where I hoped she would. Dana slid the preliminary certification across the table. Evelyn read it. She did not skim. That mattered too. Then she signed. The sound of the pen moving across paper was almost nothing. Still, I felt it in my ribs. Andrew watched her sign with his jaw set. I did not look at him for long. I did not need him to know I had noticed. Afterward, Avery and I drove home in silence, until we passed Stamford. Then she said, "Was that it?" "What?" "The trap." "It isn't a trap. You looked like a woman watching someone step onto a rake." I was trying to remain neutral. "You failed." I smiled despite myself. Then the smile faded. Nothing happens unless the records contradict her. Avery looked out the window. "And if they don't? Then we accept that." She turned toward me. "You mean that?" "Yes." It was one of the hardest things I had said. Because justice is only justice if you are willing to live with the answer you do not want. The next step was not mine. That was the point. Dana Whitmore's office began the review. I went back to work. Avery started her onboarding process for her engineering job. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then Andrew called me. As Avery's biological father and a designated family sponsor in the governance process, he had access to portions of her candidate record. He wanted to know what Martin had told me. I asked instead whether Evelyn had ever paid for something Avery believed was anonymous. His first response was not no, but, "Who told you that?" A few questions later, he admitted Evelyn had made introductions, though he refused to name them, and his denials became careful whenever money came up. I did not need 3 more arguments. I needed to know how the people around Evelyn behaved when they thought somebody else might be talking. I told Kimberly only that Evelyn was treating Avery's difficult childhood as evidence of character. Kimberly snapped that she had not left her daughter so Evelyn Prescott could take credit for the result, then insisted leaving Avery with me had been her own decision because she trusted me. When Evelyn called 2 days later about Avery's privacy request, I mentioned Kimberly's claim. Evelyn's voice cooled. Kimberly has spent 18 years turning cowardice into sacrifice. Her motives are irrelevant. Outcomes are what matter. That was enough. Within a day, Andrew contacted Kimberly. Kimberly demanded to know what I had told him, and Evelyn's office asked for copies of Andrew's disclosures to the trustee. I had lied to none of them. I had only moved small pieces of truth between rooms and let their own history supply the paranoia. The review's first finding came the following Monday. Dana Whitmore asked Avery and me to come in. Not Evelyn, not Andrew. Just us and outside counsel. The moment I saw the folder on the table, my mouth went dry. Dana did not dramatize it. She said they had identified 2 items that required clarification. The first was a tuition payment from Avery's freshman year. Not a scholarship, not foundation money. A direct payment from an account controlled personally by Evelyn Prescott to the university's student support fund, earmarked through a donor intermediary for Avery's tuition shortfall. Avery stared at her. "That's not possible." Dana turned the page. The university recorded it as anonymous donor support. "I remember that grant." "So do I said. My voice sounded far away. I remembered sitting at this same kitchen table years ago with a calculator, trying to figure out how to cover the remaining tuition after Avery's aid package changed. I remembered Avery saying she would take a semester off. I remembered a call 2 days later saying an anonymous donor had funded a retention grant. We had cried. I had called it a miracle. Avery's face had gone pale. "She paid that?" Dana nodded. Indirectly, yes. The second item was an internship introduction. The executive who had forwarded Avery's resume to a competitive summer program had previously served on a Prescott vendor advisory council and had exchanged messages with Evelyn's assistant days before making the Simon introduction. Again, not illegal. Again, not proof that Avery had not earned the position, but hidden and inconsistent with the certification. My heart was beating hard now. "What happens?" I asked. Dana folded her hands. The planned announcement of Avery as preferred future family representative is delayed pending clarification. Avery looked at me. I could not read her expression, not because it was empty, because there were too many emotions in it at once. Anger, embarrassment, doubt. I wanted to reach for her. I stopped myself. She was not 4. She did not need me to tell her what this meant. She asked Dana, "Did she buy the internship?" No evidence of that. Did she buy the tuition grant? She supplied the money. Avery swallowed. That isn't the same as me not earning college. No, Dana said. It is not. I was grateful for that answer. The truth had to be precise. Outside the conference room, Avery walked ahead of me to the elevator. When the doors closed, she leaned back against the mirrored wall and stared at the ceiling. I hate this. I know. I hate that one payment can make me question 4 years of work. It shouldn't, but it does. My chest tightened. I said the only thing I could say without turning comfort into another kind of control. She opened a door. You still walked through it. Avery looked at me, then down. I just want to know how many doors. So did I. On the drive out of Greenwich, Avery kept both hands wrapped around her phone without looking at it. At a red light, I almost told her about the summer program when she was 11, the one I had nearly canceled because I could not afford the fee, until an anonymous sponsor appeared. I stopped myself. I did not want to turn every kindness in her childhood into evidence, before the evidence existed. That was another theft I was beginning to understand. Once suspicion enters a family history, it does not stay where you put it. It spreads backward. It stains birthdays, teachers, lucky breaks, strangers who were kind. Suddenly, gratitude becomes interrogation. I reached across the console and squeezed her wrist. We don't rewrite your whole life tonight. She nodded without looking at me. Okay, but her voice told me the rewriting had already begun. That evening, Evelyn asked us to stop by the property she had intended to give Avery. I almost refused. Avery said yes. I want to see what $5 million looks like when it's disappointed. That was the first time I had heard humor in her voice all day. The house sat on a quiet road outside Greenwich, all stone and glass and expensive restraint. Evelyn met us there alone. She did not apologize for the review findings. She described the tuition payment as preventing an arbitrary interruption. Avery said, "You mean paying my bill? I mean making sure a temporary shortage did not derail a permanent trajectory." There was that word again. Trajectory. I felt my stomach tighten. Evelyn walked us through the house, as if nothing fundamental had changed. 6 bedrooms, 6.5 bathrooms, heated floors, a wine cellar, a kitchen with 2 dishwashers. At one point, Avery stood in the doorway of a guest bath and looked at me. I owned 4 towels. I laughed. I could not help it. Even Evelyn smiled. For one brief second, the house stopped being a symbol and became absurd. Then we moved on. In the main bedroom, Evelyn touched the edge of a windowsill and said, "Comfort is not the enemy, Avery. Dependence is." Avery looked at her. Was I dependent when I was 18 and couldn't pay tuition? Evelyn's face remained calm. You were at risk of losing momentum. That isn't what I asked. No. Avery stared at her. I saw something harden in my daughter's face. Not hatred. Distance. We left 20 minutes later. The next day, Dana's office sent Avery a secure portal link with additional materials responsive to the independent review. Avery asked me to sit with her while she opened them. We were at my kitchen table again, the same table where she had done algebra homework, the same table where I had filled out adoption forms, the same table where I had once believed an anonymous tuition grant meant the world had shown us kindness for no reason. There were invoices, email indexes, contact logs. Most of it was administrative noise. Then Avery opened a scanned memo from 2015. The subject line was A.M. Trajectory Stability Parameters. My skin prickled. The memo was only half a page. I read the first sentence, then the second. My throat tightened. Avery leaned closer. The language was clinical. Support only when failure threatens trajectory. Do not relieve ordinary hardship. Subject must experience consequences as endogenous. I stopped. What does endogenous mean? Avery asked. I knew the word, but hearing her ask made it sound obscene. Like it came from inside the system, I said. Like it happened naturally. Her face changed. I kept reading. Educational, housing, and employment interventions should remain below recognition threshold unless long-term developmental continuity is at risk. At the bottom, approved EP. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. And on the screen in front of us was proof that someone had treated ordinary life like a controlled environment. Avery's hand moved away from the laptop. She wanted me to think nobody was helping. I swallowed. Yes. So, I would feel like I did it alone. I looked at the memo again. No, my voice came out rough. I think she wanted you to feel like the hardship was real. Avery stared at me. My chest went cold, because suddenly Martin's metaphor was no longer a metaphor. Evelyn had not stood outside Avery's life waiting to see whether she survived. She had adjusted the temperature. Enough pain to build character. Enough help to prevent collapse. Never enough help for Avery to know she had been protected. I looked at my daughter and saw, for one sickening second, the 4-year-old with the backpack by the door. Only now the door had been part of the experiment too. For the next 3 days, the intervention memo changed the way ordinary memories felt. Avery's diploma, an anonymous tuition grant, a summer opportunity we had once called luck. None of them became fake, but each now carried a second question. Avery noticed it too. She still filled out onboarding forms for her engineering job and complained about the HR portal, yet she stopped calling those old breaks lucky. I resisted the urge to investigate every kindness in her past. Suspicion could become another kind of theft if we let it rewrite her entire life before the evidence did. On Thursday afternoon, Dana Whitmore called and asked whether I could attend the Prescott Family Governance Weekend on Saturday. The name sounded ridiculous until she explained the room. Trust representatives, family voting members, independent directors, senior family office advisors, a few spouses, no press, no donors, no television cameras. Exactly the people Evelyn cared about. Dana said the independent review was still preliminary. The intervention memo did not, by itself, prove every allegation we suspected. But it was enough to raise formal questions about whether Avery's childhood had been treated as part of a development model without disclosure. If you want the matter preserved properly, Dana told me, bring only documents you can authenticate or that connect to records we can retrieve independently. I have the assessment. We have a system copy now. The intervention memo? We have that too. I sat at my desk at work, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights. So you don't need me to prove the documents? No. We need you to state what you are asking the governance group to review. That was different. Less dramatic. More dangerous. I looked through the glass wall of my office at students waiting in line for summer registration. What exactly am I asking? Dana was quiet for a moment. That is your decision. I knew then that Saturday was not going to be about revenge. Not yet. It was going to be about refusing the story they had written for us. At home that night, Avery sat cross-legged on the couch while I explained what Dana had said. She listened with one knee pulled against her chest. So you're going. If you want me there. Her eyes lifted. Do you? Yes. Why? I thought about lying. Because I want answers. Because I want justice. Both true, neither complete, because they keep talking about your childhood like they're the authors of it. Avery looked down at her hands. And you want to correct them. I want them to stop treating correction like disrespect. That made her mouth tighten. Not quite a smile. Then she asked, "What if Evelyn says the whole thing was for my benefit?" "She will." "You sound sure." "I've met her." Avery leaned her head back against the couch. For a few seconds we sat in silence. Then she said, "I don't want you fighting for me like I'm 4. The sentence landed harder than I expected. My chest tightened. "I know. I need you beside me." "I know. Not in front of me." I swallowed. That was the line between love and control, and I had been walking it badly without realizing. I nodded. "Beside you." Saturday morning, the Prescott estate looked offensively peaceful. Blue sky, hydrangeas, dark cars arranged along the drive, staff carrying coffee as if a family crisis were something that could be catered. Avery wore a navy dress with the small silver studs I had given her at high school graduation, instead of the pearls Evelyn had sent. Inside, the meeting room had been set in a wide U. Evelyn sat near the center, Andrew 2 chairs away, and Kimberly appeared in cream without having warned me she was coming. We exchanged no smile. Dana met us near the door and said Evelyn had requested opening remarks before my agenda item. Of course she had. She wanted the symbol of Avery's homecoming in the room before anyone challenged the structure. We took our seats. The room filled slowly. I recognized only a few names, 2 Prescott cousins. A trust officer. Martin was not there. He had told me he would not attend anything connected to the family unless formally compelled. When everyone settled, Evelyn stood. She did not use notes. She spoke about family continuity, stewardship, responsibility, and the danger of confusing inherited access with earned character. Then she looked at Avery. "My granddaughter grew up outside this system," she said. "She learned discipline without the cushion of wealth. She learned accountability before entitlement. That matters." My nails pressed into my palm. Outside this system. As if the system had not been touching her from behind walls. Evelyn continued. "Whatever questions are now being reviewed, I remain proud of the woman Avery has become." I looked at her face. She meant it. That was still the worst part. The pride was real. So was the manipulation. When she finished, a few people nodded politely. Dana stood. "Before the planned family integration announcement continues, Miss Mitchell has requested that the governance group consider documents now under independent review." Every eye shifted toward me. My body reacted before my mind did. Heat climbed my neck. My mouth dried out. I could feel my pulse in the center of my palms. For 18 years, my fights had happened in kitchens, school offices, hospital waiting rooms, and phone calls no one else heard. This room was different. Everyone here knew what a trust instrument was. Everyone here understood why a certification mattered. I did not need to outshout Evelyn. I only needed to put the right question where it could not be quietly buried. I stood. I'm not asking anyone in this room to decide today that Evelyn broke a law. Evelyn's expression stayed flat. I'm not asking you to decide that Avery didn't earn what she achieved. She did. Avery looked at me. I forced myself not to look away. What I am asking is whether a child's life was used as part of a family succession development program without her knowledge, without my knowledge as the person raising her, and without honest disclosure, now that the same family wants to call the result proof of character. Silence. I heard a pen click somewhere. I continued. 3 weeks before my sister left Avery with me, the Prescott family office had already completed a household suitability assessment on me. It rated the likelihood that I would accept placement. It described me as a stable attachment figure and recommended minimal financial support unless my household was at risk of failing. Kimberly shifted. Andrew did not. The independent review also found a memo directing support only when failure threatened Avery's trajectory, while ordinary hardship was to remain in place so the consequences would feel natural. I hated the phrase, but I used it. Endogenous. The word sounded uglier out loud. One of the older men across the room frowned. I looked at Dana. The documents are already in the system. I'm not asking anyone to take my word for them. Then I looked at Evelyn. What I am asking is simple. Before anyone in this family calls what happened to Avery a homecoming, determine whether her childhood was treated like a test. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the independent trustee representative asked that the planned announcement be postponed and the matter moved into a closed review session. That was all. No shouting, no applause, no gasps. But Evelyn's face changed. Not much. A tiny tightening at the corners of her mouth. For her, it was enough. The announcement was stopped. The room began to clear. Dana asked Evelyn, Andrew, Kimberly, Avery, and me to remain with counsel in a smaller anteroom. The door closed behind the last advisor. The air changed instantly. Kimberly turned on me first. You really had to do that in front of everyone? My body was still humming from the meeting, but the anger steadied me. Yes. You could have handled this privately. I've been handling your choices privately for 18 years. Her face flushed. That is exactly what I mean. What? You need an audience now. I stared at her. She took a step closer. You have spent your whole life being the one who saves everybody. Mom called you when she was sick. Dad called you when bills were late. I called you when my marriage fell apart. And you loved it. The accusation was so intimate that for 1 second I forgot where we were. My stomach clenched. I loved it? You loved being the person who could handle everything. Andrew said, Kim, stop. She snapped toward him. Don't tell me to stop. You get to sit there like this was all my fault while your mother built spreadsheets around our daughter. Our daughter. Avery's voice cut through the room. Not loud. Everyone stopped. She was standing near the window with her arms at her sides. You both keep saying that now. Kimberly's face crumpled for half a second. Avery. No. One word. Sharp. Don't use me to win a fight with him. Kimberly went quiet. Andrew looked down. Evelyn remained seated. Calm. Still. Almost detached. That made me angrier than Kimberly's shouting. I turned to her. You knew they were unstable. Yes. You knew I would take Avery. I believed you would. You knew they weren't coming back quickly. That was not knowable. You built a plan for it. I built a contingency. My skin prickled. There it was again. I stepped closer to the table. You keep changing nouns, like that changes what happened. Evelyn looked up at me. You keep choosing the most emotional word available. She was 4. That is not an argument. It is when the subject is a 4-year-old. Evelyn's expression hardened. Andrew is what happens when a child is protected from every consequence. Andrew flinched. She did not look at him. I gave him schools, connections, money, second chances, and buffers. Every failure arrived with someone ready to absorb it. He learned dependence. Andrew said, Mom. She ignored him. Avery learned something different. My chest tightened. She learned people leave. She learned she could recover. The room seemed to narrow around us. I heard my own breath. I asked, You think that was good for her? I think adversity revealed qualities privilege might have buried. Avery stared at her grandmother. Evelyn looked at her with something close to tenderness. You are disciplined. You are careful. You understand the value of work. You do not assume rescue. Avery's face went pale. I knew why. Those were the traits she had built around fear. Evelyn was praising the scar tissue. I felt heat rush through my chest. She cried for her mother. The sentence came out rough. Evelyn looked at me. And she survived it. Everything in me went still. If Avery had broken, Evelyn could have called it weakness, Because she survived, Evelyn called the survival proof. Her theory had been built, so no outcome could disprove it. That was the trap. Dana said something about needing to keep the discussion focused on verifiable facts. I barely heard her. Because I remembered a folder at home. Not the assessment. Not the intervention memo. A counselor summary. The one I had found in the old guardianship file, and set aside because I had not wanted to read it too closely. I had brought it. It was in my bag. My hands began to shake before I touched the zipper. I pulled the folder out. This is verifiable. Andrew looked at it. His face changed immediately. That told me he remembered. I placed it on the table. This was a limited counselor status summary from the fall of 2008. It was authorized for custody and guardianship communication. Dana took it first. She checked the routing page, then passed copies to counsel. I watched Andrew. His eyes stayed on the paper. Kimberly did not reach for hers. I said, "Read the third paragraph." No one moved, so I did. Child continues sleeping beside packed bag and repeatedly asks whether improved behavior will cause mother to return. My voice nearly broke on the word improved. I swallowed and forced myself to continue. Child exhibits heightened distress around departures and interprets parental absence as possible consequence of her own behavior. The room blurred for 1 second. Not from tears, from pressure. I pressed my thumb into the edge of the paper. Dana looked at the routing stamp. This was sent to both biological parents? Yes, counsel said. The authorization and acknowledgments are attached. Andrew closed his eyes. I looked at Kimberly. You got this. She did not answer. Kim, I was not okay then. That is not what I asked. Her chin trembled. Yes. The word was barely audible. I turned to Andrew. You? He nodded once. I could feel blood pounding in my neck. Then which part did none of you understand? No one answered. My voice rose anyway. The backpack? Kimberly flinched. The part where she thought being better might make you come back? Andrew rubbed one hand over his face. Laura, contact was complicated. No. It was. No. Logistics were complicated. Shame was complicated. Your mother was complicated. Telling a 4-year-old she was not the reason you left was not complicated. His hand fell. He looked older, all of a sudden. I thought coming in and out would confuse her. You thought that? Yes. Or someone told you that. He did not answer. I turned to Kimberly. She was crying silently now. I had nothing, she said. I was living out of boxes. I was terrified. I thought if I came back before I could take her home, I would make it worse. She was not waiting for a home. My voice dropped. She was waiting for you. Kimberly covered her mouth. For half a second, I almost went to her. That old reflex. The responsible sister. The one who comforted the person who had created the mess. I did not move. Then I looked at Evelyn. She had read the summary. Her face remained composed. You got this too. The custody council received it. You knew. I knew Avery was distressed. She thought her mother left because she wasn't good enough. Yes. The calmness of that yes made my stomach turn. And you still stayed away. Evelyn's eyes met mine. Intermittent contact without a stable plan could have increased attachment disruption. It sounded almost clinical. I laughed once. The sound came out sharp. You had a sentence for everything. I had a responsibility to consider outcomes. No, you had a theory. Her expression changed. I leaned forward. And you used a child to prove it. Dana stepped in then, formally noting that the counselor record materially expanded the scope of the review. Outside counsel would preserve the related communications. The succession announcement remained suspended. I heard the procedural words, but the real shift had already happened. Nobody in that room could honestly say they had not known Avery was hurting. The summary described the pain in a 4-year-old's language, and the adults who received it had still stayed away. I closed the folder. I will cooperate with the review. Evelyn watched me. I will not sign the reconciliation agreement. I will not sign any statement saying no one interfered with reunification until the records show what actually happened. And I will not accept money to call this resolved. For the first time, I saw anger in Evelyn. Not rage. A flash. Gone almost immediately. Kimberly wiped her face. You think this makes you better than everyone? I looked at her. No. My voice was tired now. I think it means I'm done carrying everyone's version of the truth. We left the room 20 minutes later. Avery walked beside me through the hall. She had barely spoken since the counselor's summary. Outside, the afternoon sun was too bright. We made it halfway to the car before she stopped. Did you keep that backpack because of me? The question caught me off guard. I turned. What? The old one. The unicorn. Yes. Why? I looked toward the parked cars. Because I could not throw away evidence that you once believed everyone might leave. Because some part of me wanted proof I had stayed. Neither answer felt fair. I don't know, I said. Avery studied me, then nodded. We drove home without music. That night, neither of us wanted dinner. Around 8, Avery finally said she was hungry, so I ordered Chinese food from the place we had used since she was in high school. We sat at the kitchen table eating lo mein, directly from the cartons, because neither of us had the energy to pretend we were civilized. For 10 minutes, we did not talk about Prescott. Avery watched me struggle with chopsticks. You've had 12 years to learn. I know how to use them. You are holding them like medical equipment. I'm improvising. You're stabbing a noodle. It knows what it did. Avery laughed. Really laughed. Her shoulders dropped. Mine did too. For one small stretch of time, the house became ours again. No trustee, no assessment, no billionaire deciding which hardships had improved us. Just takeout cartons, bad chopstick technique, and the refrigerator making that little clicking sound I kept promising to get checked. Avery reached over and stole a dumpling from my carton. Thief. Family trait. The joke came out before either of us could stop it. Avery froze. So did I. Then she smiled faintly. Too soon? Probably. We both laughed anyway. It was the first moment all day that my body felt like it belonged to me. Then Avery's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Her smile disappeared. Kimberly. She rarely called my sister Mom. I watched her open the message. There was an image attached. A screenshot. Avery's face changed as she read. The color drained from her cheeks. What? She did not answer. She turned the phone toward me. I knew the email before I finished the first line. I love her, but some nights I wish I'd never said yes. I don't know how much longer I can do this alone. My stomach dropped. The kitchen vanished. I was back 13 years earlier, sitting on the bathroom floor with a 13-year-old Avery struggling to breathe through a panic attack while I tried to keep my own voice steady. I remembered sending that email to Kimberly at 3 a.m. I remembered the sentences before it. I remembered the sentences after. I remembered asking her to come for one weekend. She never came, but none of that was in the screenshot. Only the worst 2 lines. Avery looked at me. Her eyes were wet now. Not angry yet. Worse. Wounded. You never told me you regretted taking me. The words hit with enough force that my fingers went numb around the chopsticks. Avery. She stood. The chair scraped hard against the floor. You said you never wanted to leave. I didn't. That email says... It says I was breaking. She looked at me like she did not know which version of me to believe. And for the first time, since Evelyn Prescott had walked into our lives, I saw the oldest fear in my daughter's face turn toward me. For 1 second, I saw the 4-year-old again. Not in Avery's face exactly. She was 22. standing in my kitchen with her jaw set and her phone clenched hard enough that her knuckles had gone white. But the look in her eyes belonged to the child who once slept in sneakers because she thought being ready to leave might keep her from being left. "You said you never wanted to leave." "I didn't." "That email says, it says I was breaking." She stared at me. The words sounded weak even to my own ears. I reached for her phone. Not to take it, just to scroll. Avery pulled it back. That movement stopped me harder than a slap would have. Not because she was wrong, because she was protecting the evidence from me. I lowered my hand. "Okay." My voice came out too soft. She looked at the screenshot again. Kimberly had cropped it perfectly. No subject line, no timestamp. No sentence before, no sentence after. Just the 2 lines a frightened daughter would read as a confession. "I love her, but some nights I wish I'd never said yes. I don't know how much longer I can do this alone." My stomach cramped. "I need to show you the whole email." "Not right now." "Avery." "Not right now, Mom." The second word hurt more than the first. "Mom," still mine, but strained, like a thread pulled too tight. She left the kitchen. I heard the stairs under her feet, then her bedroom door close. Not slam. That would have been easier. I sat at the table with the takeout cooling in front of me and tried to breathe through the pressure building under my ribs. The first impulse came fast. Go upstairs, explain, tell her everything. Tell her about the night she was 13 and could not get air. Tell her I had spent 2 hours on the bathroom floor beside her while she shook. Tell her I had emailed Kimberly, because I had not slept more than 4 hours a night in a week, and I was terrified I was making the wrong decisions. Tell her I had written I wish I'd never said yes, because I wished I had never agreed to do all of it alone, not because I wished I had never chosen her. I stood, then stopped. Avery had asked for space. If I followed her now because I could not tolerate being misunderstood for 20 minutes, I would be proving exactly what I was beginning to fear about myself. That love, in my hands, could become management. I sat back down. My legs trembled under the table. The house felt suddenly unfamiliar. The same kitchen, the same refrigerator, the same ugly light over the sink. But the safest room in my life had become the place where my daughter had looked at me and wondered whether I had once wanted her gone. I did not sleep much. By 7 the next morning, Prescott Council had sent a preservation notice. It reminded me that family office material might be proprietary, ordered me not to disseminate copies outside authorized legal or governance channels, and directed future communications through counsel. My attorney called before I could reach her. Don't post, forward, threaten, or investigate around the trustee, she said. They already have system copies. Your photographs are no longer the center of this. What are they trying to do? Make the dispute about your motive instead of their records. That became clear when Dana forwarded Prescott Council's alternative context packet. It called me a devoted caregiver, then suggested my maternal bond created an emotional conflict regarding Avery's renewed contact with her biological relatives. Kimberly had signed a statement saying that, after the 2011 adoption, I increasingly discouraged direct reunification by insisting on planned visits and consistency. One example was Christmas 2012, when she described me as refusing spontaneous contact. I remembered the actual sequence. Kimberly had suggested she might come Christmas morning, let Avery watch the driveway for 2 days, canceled on Christmas Eve, and later resented my rule that future visits needed real dates and follow-through. My office suddenly felt airless. For years, my boundaries had protected a child from promises that vanished. Now the same boundaries were being relabeled obstruction. My attorney gave me one instruction I wrote on a yellow note beside my monitor. Records beat adjectives. Let the trustee pull the records. Stop giving them extra material. Avery called before lunch. I'm staying at Claire's tonight, she said. I just need some space. I told her okay. She added, I'm not mad that you were tired. I just don't know what I'm mad at yet. I let the silence remain hers. When I said I loved her, she answered softly. I know. It was not the response I wanted, but wanting more was exactly the habit I was trying to break. By late afternoon, the pressure had narrowed around the people helping us. Prescott Council challenged Martin's old notes without authentication. The family office demanded clarification about how I had seen the candidate index, and one advisor stopped returning calls. Nobody had to break a law to make a hallway feel smaller. That evening, Martin called. I knew from his first breath something was wrong. I can't do the meeting tomorrow. I was standing in my laundry room folding towels, because ordinary chores were the only things my hands still knew how to do without thinking. What happened? Prescott Council contacted me. My stomach tightened. About the NDA? Severance. Confidentiality. Deferred comp language. All of it. You told me you had the right to cooperate. I probably do. Probably. That's the problem. I set the towel down. Martin's voice was low. They don't have to win, Laura. They just have to make me spend $200,000 proving I can talk. I had no answer. He continued. My wife retired last year. We refinanced the house when my consulting business dropped during COVID. I have a daughter in graduate school. The details did not make him look weak. They made him real. I'm sorry, he said. I leaned against the dryer. No, I told you I would authenticate the codes. You told me what you could when you thought the risk was smaller. That doesn't make this better. No, it didn't. I wanted to be angry. It would have been easier to turn Martin into one more person who had abandoned us. But fear had a face now. A mortgage, a wife, a daughter, a retirement account. Martin exhaled. I spent 10 years getting my life back. I closed my eyes. I know. I can't let them take it again. I know. The words hurt because I did. He was quiet. Then he said, Don't let them convince you that fear means the records aren't real. My throat tightened. Thank you. He hung up. I stayed in the laundry room until the dryer buzzer went off. The sound made me jump. That night I ate toast over the sink because cooking felt like a performance for an audience that was not there. Avery's bedroom door stayed open upstairs. She had taken an overnight bag. Not the old backpack, a normal canvas duffel. Still, the sight of the empty room pressed something raw behind my sternum. I walked past the hall closet, stopped, opened it. The backpack sat where it had always sat, faded purple, cracked unicorn, pink plastic star. I pulled it down, dust marked my fingertips. For years I had kept it without asking why. Maybe because throwing it away felt like pretending those first months had not happened. Maybe because some part of me needed proof that I had been there when other people were not. I carried it into my bedroom and sat on the floor with it between my knees. The zipper stuck at the same corner. I tugged once. It opened. Inside was almost nothing. An old laminated name tag, one dried marker cap. A tiny sock that could not possibly have belonged to the adult woman currently sleeping at a friend's apartment because she was not sure whether I had once regretted becoming her mother. My throat closed. I pressed the sock into my palm. Then the memory came. Not Avery at 4. Avery at 13. She had come home from school angry and silent. 3 hours later, I found her sitting on the bathroom floor with her knees pulled to her chest, breathing too fast, saying she could not make it stop. I had called the pediatrician. I had sat on the tile. I had counted breaths. I had told her she was safe. After she finally slept, I went downstairs and wrote Kimberly an email at 3:12 inches the morning. I found it now, on my laptop. The full message. The subject line was, "Please call me. Kim, I don't know what to do anymore. She had another panic attack tonight. The counselor says consistency matters, but I'm one person and she knows it. I love her, but some nights I wish I'd never said yes. I don't know how much longer I can do this alone. I don't mean I don't want her. I mean, I cannot keep being mother, father, therapist, scheduler, driver, disciplinarian, and the person who tells her you're not coming again. Please come this weekend. Please show up when you say you will. She needs to know I'm not the only adult who can stay. Kimberly had replied the next afternoon. This weekend is bad. Maybe next month. That was the whole exchange. I stared at it until the letters blurred. Then I cried. Not beautifully, not quietly. My body folded forward and I pressed my fist against my mouth because the sound coming out of me felt too big for the house. I cried because the screenshot had been cruel. I cried because the full email did not make me innocent of exhaustion. I had been tired enough to write those words. I had resented the burden. I had hated being alone. There were nights when I had wanted a different life. That truth existed beside another one. I had never wanted a life without Avery. The distinction mattered. But I understood why Avery could not trust it immediately. I sat there for a long time. Then another truth arrived. Sharper. More humiliating. I had built so much of my identity around being the person who stayed that I had stopped asking whether staying could become its own form of control. I had always been the emergency contact, the one who knew the schedule, the one who packed the extra charger, the one who said no to Kimberly when visits were unreliable, the one who decided which information Avery was ready to hear. Most of those choices had been necessary. Some had probably been right, but necessity can become habit. Habit can become power. I thought about driving home from Greenwich and telling Avery I needed one day before I told her what I had heard. I thought about every time I said I was protecting her. What if I was also protecting myself from the possibility that she might choose people I hated? The thought made me physically sick. I put the backpack beside me and reached for my phone. I did not call Avery. I sent the full email. No explanation first, no argument, no defense. Then I typed, "You should have the whole thing." I was overwhelmed. I was angry. I was scared. I wished I wasn't doing it alone. I never wished you away. I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered. There was one more sentence I needed to write. The hardest one. You are allowed to be angry with me. And if you decide you want a relationship with them, I will not make you prove your loyalty to me. I will still be here. I sent it. Then I put the phone face down. My whole body shook afterward. Not because I expected Avery to leave, because for the first time, I was accepting that she could. That was what love looked like when it stopped being a rescue mission. You could not force someone to stay and still call staying proof. An hour passed, then 2. At 12:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. Avery. For half a second, I could not breathe. Her message was short. I read the whole email. Then another message appeared. I need time, but I believe you. My eyes filled again. I pressed the phone to my chest. A third message. Thank you for not telling me what I have to do next. I laughed through the tears. A wet, exhausted sound. I typed, trying a new hobby. She replied, growth looks terrible on you. That one broke me open in a different way. Not joy exactly. Relief. A little thread of us returning. I slept for 4 hours. The next morning, the Prescott machine kept moving. Counsel sent another letter. Dana requested additional records. Kimberly left a voicemail saying she had only wanted Avery to understand context. I deleted it after 10 seconds. At work, I buried myself in schedules. By evening, I felt hollow but functional. I drove home, heated soup, and sat at the kitchen table with no appetite. At 11:06 p.m., my laptop chimed. New email. The sender address meant nothing. A random string of letters and numbers. No subject. The body contained one sentence. Do not forward this to media. Give it to the independent trustee or outside counsel. They can verify the source. Below that was a link to an encrypted archive. I stared at it. Every instinct told me not to click unknown files. I forwarded the email itself to my attorney first. She called 10 minutes later. Don't open it yet. I haven't. Good. Send it to Dana through the secure channel. I did. 40 minutes later, Dana called. Her voice was different, tighter. We opened it in a controlled environment. I stood up without realizing I had. What is it? A manifest. For what? Candidate. Development files. My skin prickled. Dana told me the archive contained metadata, internal index references, meeting records, expense code crosswalks, and a recent planning memo tied to Avery's integration. Is it real? We have not authenticated everything. Some metadata matches existing systems. What does the memo say? Silence. Dana? I'm sending you a redacted copy through the portal. Avery has access as well. My stomach tightened. I opened the portal. The memo loaded. A.M. integration phase. Post-installation objectives. I read slowly. Housing transition. Governance orientation. Mentorship assignments. Then one line stopped me. Reduce dependency on L. Mitchell. Independent identity requires controlled separation from primary attachment. My fingers went cold. Controlled separation. For a second, I was back in Evelyn's study, hearing her explain that difficulty could build strength. I read the next paragraph. Suggested methods included scheduling density, independent residence, limiting informal caregiver participation in governance events, and discouraging reinforcement of legacy dependency patterns. Legacy dependency. That was me, not mother, not family. Dependency. My heart began pounding. They were not done with the experiment. They were planning the next phase. This time, the hardship was supposed to be losing me. I scrolled farther. At the bottom of the archive manifest was a file name. A.P. 2008. Acknow. Legement. Signed. I stared at the initials. A.P. Andrew Prescott. Maybe. Or maybe a file category I did not understand. I clicked nothing. I just sat there with my hands flat on the table, while a cold certainty moved through me. Someone inside the Prescott system wanted us to find this, and whoever it was knew exactly what Evelyn planned to take away next. The first thing I did after reading the words controlled separation was close my laptop. Not because I wanted to stop, because I knew exactly what would happen if I kept staring. My mind would start building a case before the evidence was authenticated. I would turn every sentence into intent, every intent into certainty, and every certainty into a plan. That was the old version of me, the version who believed loving Avery meant getting there first. I stood in the dark kitchen and pressed both palms against the table until the cold wood steadied me. My heartbeat was heavy but regular. Outside, someone's sprinkler clicked across a lawn in slow arcs. The sound was absurdly peaceful. Controlled separation. They had taken the thing Avery feared most as a child and given it a management label. I wanted to call Evelyn and scream. Instead, I called my attorney. She answered on the second ring. Tell me you did not contact anyone. I did not contact anyone. Good. I want to. I know. That memo says they want to reduce Avery's dependence on me. Laura, I am not interpreting that. Those are the words. I know. Dana sent me the redacted copy. I closed my eyes. What do I do? Nothing tonight. I laughed once without humor. You know I'm terrible at that. Then, consider it litigation training. Despite myself, I almost smiled. She continued. Tomorrow, you decide whether you want to keep fighting on emotion or move this entirely into process. What does that mean? It means stop trying to beat Evelyn at being Evelyn. The sentence landed. I stood still. She has money, staff, lawyers, records, and 40 years of institutional practice. You have something she underestimates. What? You are willing to let the records say something you may not like. I thought about Avery, about telling her she could choose them, about meaning it. My attorney said, "That is what makes you credible. Do not give it up now." I barely slept. The next morning, Avery came home before 7. I heard her key in the front door while I was making coffee. She came into the kitchen wearing the same gray hoodie she had lived in through finals week, her hair twisted into a loose knot. For half a second, neither of us spoke. Then she held up a paper bag. Bagels. I looked at it. That feels manipulative. It has scallion cream cheese. That is definitely manipulative. She smiled. Small, careful, but real. I took the bag. She sat at the table while I poured coffee. The silence between us was different from the one after the email. Less like distance, more like two people deciding where to place something heavy. You saw the memo, I said. She nodded. Dana called me. I set her mug down. What do you want to do? Avery wrapped both hands around the coffee. I don't know yet. That's okay. Her eyes lifted. You mean that? Yes. She studied me as if checking for the hidden condition. I let her. Finally, she said, I want to know if she planned that before she ever showed up. The separation? Yes. Then we find out. And if she did? I sat across from her. That part is yours. She looked down. There was a long pause. Then she said, I don't want to run away from them just because you hate them. My stomach tightened. I don't hate all of them. That is not the important part of that sentence. No. I took a breath. You are right. She nodded. I also don't want to walk into that house because some part of me still wants one of them to say they chose me. The confession was so quiet I almost missed it. My chest ached. Avery stared into her coffee. I know how stupid that sounds. It doesn't. It does. I'm 22. You were 4 before you were 22. Her mouth tightened. I reached across the table but stopped before touching her hand. She saw me stop. Then she turned her palm upward. I put my hand over hers. For a few seconds, we sat like that. No plan, no speech. Just contact. Then I said, I think I need to do something you're going to hate. Avery looked suspicious. What? Call Evelyn. She pulled her hand back. Why? Because she needs to think I'm done fighting. Avery stared at me. Then she leaned back. Oh, exactly. That sounded disturbingly competent. I've been taking notes. From who? Satan? Operations management. Same department. I laughed. The laugh surprised both of us. It did not erase what was happening. It reminded me we were still ourselves inside it. I called Evelyn at 9:30. She answered without greeting. Laura, I want to stop this. Silence, not surprise. Assessment. I continued before she could ask what I meant. The fighting. The family spectacle. The constant review of old wounds. I agree that would be healthier. Of course she did. I think I made this about protecting Avery from you. And now? Now I think she has to make her own decision. Another pause. What changed? I looked at Avery. She was standing by the sink pretending not to listen. I did. That was true enough to make the lie work. Evelyn's voice softened. I am glad. I'm willing to stop speaking publicly about the family dispute. You have not spoken publicly. I'm willing to agree not to. That got her attention. I assume your attorney will review the language. Yes. And you will stop interfering with Avery's integration meetings? I will stop trying to control whether she attends them. Also true. Evelyn was quiet. Then she said, "There is a governance weekend at the end of August. If Avery chooses to complete the process, I would like you there." My fingers tightened around the phone. Why? Because whatever you believe about me, you are part of her history. Part of her history. Not her mother. I swallowed the anger. Send the documents. After I hung up, Avery exhaled. That was awful. Yes. You sounded sincere. I was sincere. That is worse. It was. The agreement arrived 2 hours later. My attorney stripped the broad, non-disparagement language down until it barred public disclosure of confidential records, but preserved my right to cooperate with the trustee, board, outside counsel, auditors, regulators, and any legal process. Evelyn's lawyers accepted the carve-outs. They thought I had surrendered because I had agreed to stop making noise. I understood for the first time that silence could be strategic instead of submissive. Kimberly called that night, relieved. You finally learned to let go. I looked across the kitchen at Avery reading the marked-up agreement. Maybe I did. After I hung up, Avery asked, "Did you?" I answered with the truest sentence I had. "I quit trying to win you." Her eyes changed, but neither of us turned it into a speech. The next week passed quietly on the surface, while outside counsel verified the anonymous archive. Then Avery asked me to sit with her in the living room. She had her laptop open. "I can access the candidate portal now." I sat beside her. "What does that mean?" "It means the records they're using to evaluate me. Education history, mentorship recommendations, financial literacy modules, governance stuff. Do not open anything you are not authorized to open." She looked at me. I know. I needed to say it. Why? Because I have developed a reputation for binders. That got a reluctant smile. She clicked through folders. Most were exactly what they claimed to be. College transcripts, employment history, conflict disclosures, a family tree document, then a tab labeled sponsor inputs. Avery opened it. There were statements from Evelyn, Andrew, and 2 senior advisors. Avery read silently. Then she stopped. "What?" She turned the screen. One section asked whether any sponsor had arranged undisclosed developmental advantages or disadvantages. Evelyn had answered no. Andrew had answered, "Not to my knowledge." Avery stared at the phrase. "That is such a coward's answer." I did not disagree. She scrolled farther. Another question asked whether any family member had intentionally structured exposure to hardship or independence. Evelyn's response: "Ordinary life circumstances were not managed by the family." Avery leaned back. "She knows that's not true. We know there are records that contradict it." "No, Mom. She knows." Her voice had changed. Anger, finally. Clean anger. She knew about the tuition. She knew about the internship. She knew about the memo. She approved it. I nodded. Avery's eyes were bright. She is still doing it. Maybe. Avery snapped the laptop shut. "No, don't do that." "Do what?" "Turn every fact back into, maybe because you are scared of telling me what it means." The accusation landed because it was fair. I sat still. "You are right." She stood and paced once to the window. "I want to finish the integration." My stomach dropped. I had promised myself I would not react. My body reacted anyway. Heat rushed up my neck. My chest tightened. Avery saw it. I knew that would happen. "I'm listening." "No, you're trying not to panic." "Both can be true." She folded her arms. "I want access to what they are using to judge me. I want to hear what Evelyn says when she thinks I'm still considering her offer. I want to know whether the life I remember is the same life in their records." I stood slowly. "You are not going in there to spy." "I know." "You are not taking documents you're not authorized to see." "I know." You are not putting yourself alone with... Avery's face changed. I stopped. The old protective reflex rose again, sharp enough that I felt it before I could name it. I closed my mouth. Avery waited. I forced my hands to unclench. What do you need from me? The question came out rough. Her shoulders lowered. Believe I can walk into that house without becoming theirs. My throat tightened. I do. Even if I accept something from them? That was harder. I made myself answer. Yes. She watched me. Even the house? My stomach turned over. $5 million. The number still had the power to make me feel small. Yes. It hurt to say. That was how I knew I meant it. Avery crossed the room and hugged me. No warning. Her arms went around my shoulders, and for a second I could not move. Then I held her. Not too tightly. That mattered now. Outside counsel began verifying the anonymous archive. Dana kept us updated without overpromising. Some metadata matched the family office system. Several expense codes corresponded to real vendor categories. The current controlled separation memo appeared authentic, but needed source confirmation. The file labeled A.P. 2008, Acknowledgement. Signed had not been opened in the copy we received because counsel wanted the original system record, not a potentially altered attachment. I asked Dana if she knew who sent it. No. Can you trace it? We are trying. Do you think it's Martin? No. The answer came fast. Why? The access pattern doesn't match anything connected to him. I thought about Andrew. The initials? The password hint. Then stopped myself. Records beat adjectives. Evidence beat suspicion. The family office scheduled the final governance weekend for August 29. The cream invitation called the house key moment a ceremonial residence presentation, which Avery said sounded like the unveiling of a battleship. Kimberly called twice about clothes. Andrew sent Avery careful messages saying he was proud of how she was handling things. She answered none of them. The night before the event, Avery packed an overnight bag for the hotel Dana had arranged. I caught myself checking whether she had a charger, toothbrush, and medication until she said, "Mom, I'm 22, not fleeing a natural disaster." The joke stopped both of us. For a second, the old purple backpack seemed present without either of us naming it. Avery rested her head against my shoulder, and I let the silence hold what we both understood. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text. Parking lot. Behind street. Agnes Community Center. 9:30. Come alone. Bring no files. Avery lifted her head. What is it? I showed her. Her mouth tightened. You're not going alone. I am not going at all until Dana sees it. We sent the message to outside counsel. Dana called 20 minutes later. We cannot confirm sender, but the number routes through the same privacy service used for the archive. My heart sped up. What do you want me to do? Do not bring documents. Park in the lit section. Keep your phone on. We'll have someone nearby but out of sight. Avery said. I'm coming. Dana heard her. No. Avery opened her mouth. Dana continued. If this is an insider who is afraid, 2 people may scare them off. Laura is the contact. Avery looked furious. I understood. For once, I was the person walking into the unknown. At 9:27, I pulled into the community center lot. The building was dark except for a security light near the rear entrance. My mouth was dry. A sedan was parked 3 rows over. I recognized it, not the black Prescott car, Andrew's. My hands went cold on the steering wheel. The driver's door opened. Andrew stepped out. For several seconds I just stared. He looked terrible. No jacket. Shirt wrinkled. Face gray with exhaustion. I got out. What are you doing? He looked toward the street. Did anyone follow you? Dana knows I'm here. He shut his eyes briefly. Fine. What did you send? He reached into the car and pulled out a thin folder. My pulse hammered. Andrew. I sent the archive. The words were quiet. I felt anger before surprise. Hot and immediate. You let us spend weeks guessing who was inside that system. I couldn't send it from anything connected to me. You could have told the truth 18 years ago. His face tightened. I know. No, you don't get to say that like it closes something. I'm not trying to close it. He held out the folder. I did not take it. What is it? The original acknowledgement. My stomach dropped. A.P. Andrew Prescott. He opened the folder himself. The first page was the 2008 household assessment. The second was a signature page. His name. His signature. His initials beside the designation of me as preferred contingency placement. I stopped breathing. He had known. Not vaguely. Not after the fact. Known. My fingers went numb. You signed this? Yes. You knew before Kim came to my house? Yes. The parking lot seemed to tilt. I heard a car pass on the road beyond the trees. You knew she was bringing Avery to me. I knew you were the preferred placement if Kim couldn't keep a stable home during the divorce. And you let her tell me it was for a few weeks? His face twisted. I told myself it would be. I laughed once. It came out ugly. You people survive on things you told yourselves. Andrew looked down. I went back to Prescott Holdings. My mother offered me a path back into the company, trust access, stability. I told myself Avery was safer with you while I got my life together. You built another family. Yes. The word surprised me. No excuse after it. Just yes. I looked at him. Why now? He reached into the folder and pulled out another document. Newer. A draft memo. Avery Integration Attachment Stabilization. I knew the language before I read it. He pointed to one paragraph. Post-installation. Reduce frequency of contact with Laura Mitchell during first 6 months of residential transition. Encourage independent routines. Avoid reinforcement of legacy dependency. My stomach turned. She sent this to you? Yes. Why? Because she wanted me to support it. His voice cracked for the first time. She said Avery needed to separate from you if she was going to become fully independent. I stared at him. And that bothered you now? His jaw tightened. It sounded familiar. I waited. Andrew looked at the paper. When I was 23, my mother decided my fiancé was making me dependent. She cut off access to a family account, pressured a landlord, and made sure a job offer in another city disappeared. I chose the company. I chose her approval. I told myself I had no choice. He looked at me. When I read this memo, I realized she was building the same cage for Avery. Something inside me hardened. You didn't send this because you suddenly became her father. He flinched. I stepped closer. You sent it because you finally recognized yourself. Andrew closed his eyes, then nodded. Yes. The honesty did not redeem him, but it changed the air. I looked at the signature page again. 18 years of excuses reduced to ink. Will you authenticate this? Yes. To the trustee? Yes. To the board if they ask? Yes. Under oath if it goes that far? His face went pale. Then he said, yes. I took the folder. My hands were steady now. You understand this doesn't buy you anything with Avery. I know. No forgiveness. No dad title. No shortcut. I know. I looked at him until he stopped trying to look away. No. You hope. He swallowed. You don't know. For once, Andrew Prescott had no answer. I put the folder under my arm. Then he said, Laura. I stopped. There are more files. My skin went cold. What do you mean? He looked toward the dark building behind me. Avery wasn't the only one. I thought of Martin's warning. Candidate. Not child. Not grandchild. Candidate. How many? Andrew shook his head. I don't know. Who does? He looked at me. My mother. Then he added, almost too quietly to hear, and tomorrow she's planning to tell the whole family her system finally worked. I did not sleep after meeting Andrew. I drove home with the original acknowledgement, sealed in a document envelope on the passenger seat, and every red light felt like an accusation. His signature was in there. His name. His agreement that I was the preferred contingency placement before Kimberly ever stood on my porch pretending she had run out of options. For years, I had imagined the worst thing would be discovering that somebody had planned Avery's abandonment. I had been wrong. The worst thing was discovering how many people had called it something else. Contingency, stability, trajectory, development. Every polished word took one human act and moved it half an inch away from responsibility. By the time I pulled into my driveway, dawn had started bleaching the sky gray. Avery was sitting on the front steps. She had a coffee in both hands and my old college sweatshirt over her pajamas. I parked and got out. She stood immediately. Well? I looked at her. There are moments when a parent's instinct is to soften the truth before handing it over. I could feel that instinct rise in me like muscle memory. I did not use it. It was Andrew. Her face went still. He sent the archive? Yes. Why? Because Evelyn sent him a current plan for reducing your contact with me after the integration. Avery's jaw tightened. And suddenly he grew a conscience. No, I came up the walk and stopped in front of her. He recognized himself. She waited. I told her about the old assessment. Andrew's signature. His decision to return to Prescott Holdings while telling himself she was safer with me. I told her he had agreed to authenticate the records for the trustee and the board if necessary. Avery listened without moving. When I finished, she looked down at the coffee. So he knew? Yes. Before Mom left me. Yes. She flinched almost invisibly at the word Mom. Kimberly still owned that word in some old chamber of her, even if Avery almost never used it aloud. She sat back down. I sat beside her. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then she asked, "Did he say he was sorry?" "Yes." "Did you believe him?" "I believe he is sorry now." That wasn't what I asked. I looked at her. "No." Avery nodded. "Me neither." The answer was flat, but her thumb was rubbing the paper seam of the coffee cup until it had gone soft. I wanted to take the cup away. I wanted to take the morning away. Instead, I said, "He also said there are more files." Her thumb stopped. "What kind?" "Candidate files." Her eyes lifted. "On other people?" "Yes." "How many?" "He doesn't know." She stared out at the street. A jogger passed with a golden retriever. Somewhere, a garage door opened. Normal Saturday morning. My daughter, sitting on the steps learning her grandmother, may have turned an entire generation of relatives into experiments. "I want to go tomorrow," Avery said. I had expected it. My body still resisted. My ribs tightened. The back of my neck went hot. I made myself breathe once before answering. "Okay?" She glanced at me. "That's it? That's it? No speech about danger?" "I have several prepared." "Of course you do. I'm choosing growth." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." Avery smiled faintly. Then she leaned her shoulder against mine. We sat there until the coffee went cold. At 9, Dana called with outside counsel. Andrew's authentication had accelerated the forensic review. Enough metadata, expense codes, and internal records matched Prescott systems to justify interim protections, though nobody was calling the investigation final. Some family office work appeared to have used vendors that also billed Prescott Holdings, creating disclosure and conflict questions. Dana kept the authority lines simple. The independent trustee could act inside the trust and family office structure, preserve records, remove Evelyn from Avery's succession matter, and suspend her discretionary role there. Only the Prescott Holdings Board could act on her chair position, so an independent special committee was reviewing the corporate vendor issues separately. Two processes. Two sources of power. Evelyn did not control alone. "What happens tomorrow?" Avery asked. "Evelyn insists on completing her final sponsor certification," Dana said. "Once she signs, the trustee will compare it with the verified record. The board committee will act separately if its own threshold is met." Martin would attend under a formal request, after outside counsel confirmed that his severance and confidentiality terms did not bar cooperation with an authorized investigation. I thought of the man in the diner who had been afraid of spending his retirement, proving he was allowed to speak. He was still afraid. This time the process meant he would not be standing alone. Before the call ended, Dana confirmed legal holds on candidate development records and related vendor communications. Nobody could quietly clean the files while we were at the family event. When the call ended, I looked at Avery. "If you want out, we walk." She stared at me. "You really mean that?" "Yes. Even now. Especially now." Her eyes held mine for several seconds. Then she said, "No. I want her to finish." "Finish what?" "Explaining why she thinks this was love." That sentence stayed with me the rest of the day. Before we left for Greenwich, Dana sent one last message through the secure portal. The trustee had placed a legal hold on the candidate development records, meaning nobody in the family office could destroy, alter, or quietly clean up files, while the review continued. The Prescott Holdings Special Committee had issued a separate preservation notice for vendor invoices and communications that touched company resources. Two different entities, two different chains of authority. For the first time since this began, I understood why Evelyn had always seemed untouchable. Everyone around her had treated her power as one solid thing. It was not. It was a collection of permissions, titles, votes, signatures, habits, and people who had stopped asking whether she should still have them. That did not guarantee anything. It only meant the locks finally had keys that were not in Evelyn's pocket. I printed Dana's message and folded it into my purse, even though I knew I would not need it. Old habit. Paper made facts feel heavier. Avery watched me do it from the hallway. "You know they have copies there." "I know." "You know your purse is not an evidence locker." "I know." She pointed at me. "This is why TSA hates you." "I carry snacks. TSA respects preparedness." She shook her head and walked away smiling. By 4, I had laid out 3 dresses on my bed. Avery stood in the doorway. "Are we overthrowing a dynasty or attending a Presbyterian fundraiser?" "I hate all 3. The navy one." "I wore that to your graduation." "Exactly." "Why exactly?" "Because if they're going to talk about my life, you should look like my mother, not like you dressed for them." I turned toward her. The navy dress was simple, knee-length, slightly faded at the seams if you looked closely. I had bought it on sale the week before her graduation because Avery told me my old black dress made me look like I was attending the funeral of higher education. I picked it up. "Navy. Good. What are you wearing?" "The green one. The one Evelyn's stylist said was too casual?" Avery smiled. "That's why." "For the first time all day," I laughed. The next morning, Greenwich looked polished enough to deny anything ugly had ever happened there. The Prescott estate sat above the Sound with its stone facade glowing in late August sun. Staff directed cars toward the side drive. A temporary canopy had been set near the terrace for lunch. Through tall windows, I could see flower arrangements in muted cream and green. No cameras, no reporters, no circus. The audience was smaller and more dangerous than that. People who could vote. People who could preserve records. People whose signatures changed what happened next. I stepped out of my car and immediately felt the muscles in my stomach tighten. Avery came around from the passenger side. "You okay?" "No." "Great." "You?" "No." We looked at each other. Then she said, "At least we're coordinated." We walked inside. Kimberly was near the foyer. She wore a pale blue dress and pearls. She looked expensive and nervous. Her eyes moved over me and stopped at my navy dress. "At least you finally understood this isn't your room." The line was quiet enough that only I heard it. For a second, the old me wanted to answer. Something sharp. Something that would leave a mark. Instead, I looked past her into the dining room. The table seated 24. I thought, absurdly, that it had enough chairs for a municipal hearing. That almost made me smile. "I'm aware," I said. Kimberly's mouth tightened, because I had denied her the fight. Avery came up beside me. Kimberly's face transformed. Soft, hopeful. "Avery." "Hi. I saved you a seat with us." Avery looked toward the family table. "I'm sitting with Mom until the session starts." Kimberly's eyes flicked to me. A tiny thing. A wound she had no right to claim and still clearly felt. For 1 second, I almost pitied her. Then I remembered the cropped email. Love did not erase cowardice. Evelyn entered from the East Hall. She wore charcoal gray, no pearls, no dramatic entrance. People simply noticed her. That was power too. Her eyes went first to Avery, then to me. She came over and kissed Avery lightly on the cheek. "I'm glad you came, Suongi." Evelyn looked at me. "Laura." "Evelyn." Her gaze moved over my dress. I remember that one. The comment chilled me. She had seen photographs. Of course she had. Avery's graduation, my dress, my house, my surgery. The boundary between knowing family and observing us had been broken for so long that even ordinary recognition felt invasive. Evelyn said, "Whatever happens today, I hope you understand that Avery will always honor what you did for her." There it was. What you did. Completed service. An act with an end date. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, but Avery answered before I could. "She doesn't need me to honor it." Evelyn looked at her. "No?" "No, she's my mother." Simple. No speech. Evelyn's face barely moved, but I felt something inside myself settle. Not triumph. Belonging. We were directed into the governance room shortly before 10. The layout was more formal than the family weekend in June. The independent trustee sat at one side with counsel. Several family voting members occupied the center. 3 independent Prescott Holdings directors were present as observers for the portion relevant to shared resources. Andrews sat 2 chairs from Evelyn. He looked at me once. I gave him nothing. Martin was near the far wall beside outside counsel. When our eyes met, he looked exhausted. I walked over before the meeting began. "You came. I received a formal request." "That wasn't what I meant." He glanced toward Evelyn. "No." He rubbed his palms on his trousers. "I still don't know if this was smart." "You don't have to be brave for me." Martin looked back at me. "That may be the nicest thing anyone has said in this house." Low bar. That earned the faintest smile. Then counsel called the room to order. I sat beside Avery. My hands were cold. I tucked them under the edge of my legal pad so nobody could see. Dana opened with procedural language. The succession review had not been completed. No final designation would be effective until conflicts were resolved. The purpose of the session was to complete sponsor disclosures, preserve the candidate's own position, and create a record before the trustee considered interim measures. Evelyn listened with the patience of someone enduring bureaucracy. Then she stood. This was what Andrew had meant. She intended to tell the family her system had worked. Evelyn did not call it a system. She called it stewardship. She spoke about her own childhood for the first time in front of me. Her mother left when she was 9. She moved between relatives, worked at 15. Learned, she said, that security could make people careless and adversity could strip away illusion. I do not romanticize hardship, she said. I nearly laughed. She continued, but I know what it reveals. Her eyes moved toward Andrew. My greatest failures as a parent came from believing love meant removing consequences. Andrew looked down. Then she turned to Avery. My granddaughter grew without the insulation of this family. She studied without expectation of inheritance. She worked without a Prescott name opening the front door. She chose a profession because it interested her, not because it pleased us. Some of that was true. That was what made the speech effective. Truth placed carefully around a lie. Evelyn's voice softened. She was tested by life before this family ever asked anything of her. My fingers curled under the table. Before this family ever asked anything of her, I looked at Martin. He stared straight ahead. Avery sat perfectly still. Evelyn continued. Today, I ask that we recognize not a child who has returned for privilege, but a woman who has demonstrated she can carry responsibility without being defined by it. There were nods around the room. Not many. Enough. Evelyn looked almost luminous with conviction. I understood then why exposing her had always been difficult. She did not think she was hiding something ugly. She thought everyone else lacked the courage to understand what she had done. Dana waited until Evelyn sat. Then outside counsel placed a document in front of her. Mrs. Prescott, under the family governance policy, this is the final sponsor certification. You have reviewed the language previously? Yes. You understand the certification includes direct and indirect intervention, including use of personal contacts, family office resources, or affiliated company resources, if material to the candidate's developmental trajectory? Yes. My pulse began hammering. There was nowhere left for the definition to hide. Counsel continued. You understand that assistance is not itself disqualifying. The issue is non-disclosure. Yes. And you still certify that no undisclosed material intervention distorted the evaluation of Miss Mitchell's independence? Evelyn looked at the paper, then at Avery. Yes. Andrew shifted. I heard the chair legs scrape the floor. Evelyn picked up the pen. She read every line. Slowly. No trick, no hidden clause, no rushed signature. Then she signed. Evelyn Hart Prescott. The sound of the pen was soft. I felt it in my teeth. Dana accepted the page without expression. Outside counsel marked the time. Martin closed his eyes briefly. Nothing exploded. No one shouted. The room moved on. That was almost unbearable, because I knew what had just happened. Evelyn had taken the last plank in the bridge and nailed it down herself. The formal session recessed before lunch. The family moved to the terrace. I stood near the railing, trying to get air. The sound was bright blue below us. Sailboats moved in the distance. Avery came beside me. How are your hands? I looked down, still shaking. You noticed. You hide things badly. I raised an engineer. Everything is an inspection. She leaned against the railing. Do you think she believes what she signed? Yes. Avery looked at me. That was fast. She believes intervention only counts if it made you weak. Avery's mouth tightened. So if I succeeded, none of it counts. That's how she protects the theory. Avery looked toward the house. She really thinks she loves me. Yes. Her eyes turned back to the water. That's worse. I know. We were called inside 20 minutes later. Not back to the governance room. To the long drawing room overlooking the lawn. The atmosphere had changed. Less procedural. More family theater. A rectangular table near the windows held a small lacquered box. I knew what was inside before Evelyn opened it. Keys. Avery's face went blank. Evelyn lifted the ring and held it out. "These are ceremonial," she said. "The deed transfer would follow council's process if you choose to accept." At least nobody was pretending keys transferred real estate. The thought was so absurdly practical that I almost laughed from nerves. Evelyn continued. "The house is yours if you complete the process and choose to take your place in this family." Avery did not move. Kimberly stood near Andrew, watching with wet eyes. I wondered what she saw. Her daughter receiving something she never could have given her? Proof that leaving had somehow worked out? A second chance she had not earned? Andrew looked sick. Evelyn stepped closer. Her voice became quieter. "Not for the room. For Avery. You've proven you're worthy of coming home." The words traveled through me with the force of memory. A 4-year-old in sneakers, a backpack by the door. "If I'm good, will Mom come back?" My lungs stopped halfway through a breath. I looked at Avery. She was staring at the keys. For one terrible second, I felt every old fear I had promised not to obey. $5 million. A name. A trust. A family powerful enough to make the world bend around inconvenience. What if she wanted it? What if she wanted them? What if she took the keys and I became the safe place she had outgrown? The fear was ugly. I let it exist. Then I let it pass. Avery had asked me to believe she could walk into this house without becoming theirs. I believed her, and even if she chose something I hated, love did not become false, because it was not chosen back in the way I wanted. I loosened my hands. Avery reached out. She took the keys. Kimberly inhaled sharply. A tiny smile appeared on her face. Andrew looked toward me. I did not look at him. Evelyn's shoulders lowered for the first time all day. Victory. She believed she had it. Avery closed her fingers around the keys. Then she turned. Toward me. The room disappeared at the edges. All I could see was my daughter. Not the 4-year-old. Not the candidate. Not the granddaughter. Avery. 22. Standing on her own feet. I gave her nothing. No nod. No warning. No plea. Behind her, Dana Whitmore quietly closed the ceremonial folder. The independent trustee rose. "We'll proceed." A door opened at the far end of the room. The independent directors who had been waiting for the separate corporate session stepped inside. Evelyn turned toward the sound. Avery kept looking at me. Her fingers tightened once around the keys. Then her lips parted. 6 words were about to change the meaning of home. "Mom, you were always my home." 6 words. That was all. No speech. No trembling confession. No dramatic pause designed for the room. Just 6 words spoken by the woman I had raised, while a $5 million house key rested in her palm. For 1 second, nobody moved. I felt the sentence hit me physically before I understood what it had done. My chest tightened so suddenly, I had to pull in air through my nose. Heat rushed behind my eyes. My hands, which had been shaking all morning, went completely still. Avery did not smile. She looked at me with the same quiet certainty she had used years ago when she told me she wanted to study engineering because bridges make more sense than people. Then she turned back toward Evelyn. She opened her hand. The keys lay across her palm. "I'm not accepting the house today." Evelyn's expression changed so little that anyone who had known her less than a month might have missed it. I did not. Her chin lifted. A fraction. Her fingers tightened against the side seam of her jacket. "Avery," she said, "it's not a no forever." Kimberly's face brightened. Then Avery continued, "It's a no to accepting it while I don't know what it's attached to." Kimberly's expression collapsed again. Evelyn stared at her granddaughter. "The property is mine personally." "I know. It is not a trust distribution." "I know. There is no hidden financial condition." Avery nodded once. "That isn't the condition I'm worried about." The room was silent enough that I heard someone near the back shift their weight. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "What condition do you imagine?" Avery looked at the keys. Belonging. The word moved through the room differently than home had. I looked at Evelyn. She did not understand yet. Or maybe she understood and refused the premise. Avery placed the keys on the table between them. I'm not going to accept something worth $5 million while you're still deciding what kind of relationship I'm allowed to have with my mother. Evelyn's gaze went to me. There it was. Not hatred, calculation, as if I had become a measurement problem again. Dana Whitmore stepped forward before Evelyn could answer. We need to continue the formal session. Evelyn turned. This can wait. No. Dana's voice was calm. Not loud. That made it stronger. The sponsor certification has been executed. The independent trustee has received preliminary findings that materially conflict with portions of that certification. Under the governance policy, we need to address them now. For the first time all morning, Evelyn looked surprised. Not afraid. Surprised. She glanced toward outside counsel. The lead attorney opened a folder. We are not making final findings today. We are identifying verified records sufficient to trigger interim governance measures and further review. Evelyn's eyes went to Andrew. He looked down. That was when she knew. I saw it happen. The moment she understood someone inside her circle had stopped protecting her. Her face did not collapse. It became more controlled. Which, with Evelyn, was the closest thing to panic. The doors to the adjoining room opened wider. 3 independent Prescott Holdings directors entered with corporate counsel. They did not sit near the family trust representatives. Separate authority, separate process. Exactly as Dana had explained. I had spent weeks fearing Evelyn because her power looked like one enormous wall. Now, standing in that room, I finally saw the seams. The trustee controlled some things. The corporate board controlled others. The family office had its own charter. Evelyn had influence over all of them. Influence was not the same as ownership. That distinction was about to matter. Outside counsel walked the room through the chain we already knew, but this time none of it depended on my phone photographs or Martin's memory. The pre-placement household assessment, the minimum intervention directive, the tuition money, the internship contact, the family office coding, and the current controlled separation memo had been recovered or cross-checked against system originals. Counsel was precise about what the evidence did and did not mean. Evelyn's personal money could legally help Avery. An introduction did not erase Avery's merit. The issue was concealment, while Evelyn certified that Avery's independence had not been materially shaped by undisclosed Prescott intervention. Counsel put the controlled separation memo in front of Evelyn. She acknowledged approving the concept, but insisted it was developmental guidance, not a command, and therefore not material. The attorney pointed to the final certification she had signed less than an hour earlier. Your position is that financial support, professional introductions, selective intervention, and a planned reduction in contact with her legal mother were not material? They did not create her character, Evelyn said. That was not the question. Avery leaned forward. No one said I didn't work hard. I did. I also got help I didn't know came from you. Both can be true. When Evelyn argued that the help had not diminished her, Avery answered, Then why did I have to not know? The room went still. If it was just help, you could have told me. You needed the hardship to feel natural because you wanted a result. For once, I did not need to interpret the silence for her. Avery was standing inside her own story and naming what had been done to it. Martin Keene was asked to authenticate the candidate development coding system. He stood near outside counsel with one hand braced against the back of a chair. His voice shook once at the beginning, then steadied. He explained the original purpose of candidate development: mentorship, education, governance readiness, then how the categories expanded: observation, intervention, minimum necessary. He confirmed the code structure in the recovered records matched the one used while he was Director of Compliance. Counsel asked whether he had objected. Yes. To what? Using family, office resources to shape personal behavior without informed participation. Evelyn cut in. You objected to administrative classification. Martin looked at her. I saw the fear in his face. Then something else. Fatigue. Mrs. Prescott, I objected because you were treating relatives like programs. The room went very still. Evelyn's eyes hardened. Martin did not look away. Outside counsel thanked him and moved on. Andrew was next. He looked worse than he had in the parking lot. The counselor handed him the 2008 acknowledgement. He confirmed the signature. His. He confirmed he had known I was the preferred placement before Kimberly arrived at my house. My throat tightened. Even knowing it was coming did not make hearing it easier. Counsel asked, Did you tell Laura Mitchell that an assessment had been completed before Avery was placed with her? No. Did you believe the placement would become permanent? Andrew stared at the table. At first, no. What changed? He swallowed. I went back to the company. My life stabilized. I kept telling myself that moving Avery again would hurt her. Did you attempt structured reunification? No. Why? He looked toward Evelyn, then stopped himself. That mattered. When he spoke, he looked at counsel. Because I chose not to. Kimberly turned toward him. Her face went red. What? Andrew did not look at her. I chose my career. I chose stability. I chose not to fight my mother. I told myself Avery was safer with Laura. Kimberly stared at him like he had betrayed an agreement they had never spoken aloud. You let me take the blame for years. Andrew finally looked at her. You left too. I was 29 and falling apart. You were 29, not 12. Her chair scraped backward. Your mother controlled every dollar. You still had choices. So did you. I know. The words stopped her. Because Andrew was not defending himself anymore. That left Kimberly alone with her own defense. She looked around the room. At least I knew Laura loved her. I felt something twist under my ribs. There it was again. My love used as retroactive permission. I stood before I knew I was going to. No. Every head turned. Kimberly stared at me. I kept my voice low. You do not get to do that anymore. Her eyes narrowed. Do what? Use me as your alibi. Her mouth opened. I continued. You knowing I would take care of Avery does not turn leaving her into a responsible decision. I was trying to keep her safe. You were trying to keep yourself from collapsing. That is not the same thing. No. I felt my pulse in my throat. It's not. And maybe I would have understood that if you had ever said it honestly. Kimberly's eyes filled. I loved her. I know. The words surprised her. They surprised me too, but they were true. You loved her, I repeated, and you still left. Her face crumpled. That was the thing none of us had wanted to admit. Love was not always enough to make someone act lovingly. A person could love you and still fail you. Sometimes that was worse than indifference. Because it meant the wound had not come from absence of feeling. It had come from a choice stronger than feeling. Evelyn's voice cut across the room. This is becoming emotional theater. I turned. No. Dana spoke before I could. This is becoming relevant testimony. Evelyn stared at her. Dana continued. The independent trustee has enough verified information to take interim action regarding the succession process and the family office. No one moved. She read from the prepared resolution. Evelyn was recused from Avery's succession review. Her discretionary authority over candidate development and related family office governance functions was suspended pending full investigation. A legal hold remained over all candidate files. An independent governance council would oversee the review. Evelyn's face remained still, but the color had left it. She looked toward the Prescott Holdings directors. The interim lead director spoke next. This board is acting separately. Important words. Separately. Based on preliminary evidence that Prescott Holdings vendors and resources may have been used for undisclosed personal family development work, the special committee had voted to place Evelyn on administrative leave from her role as chair pending investigation. Not CEO, not owner, not beneficiary, chair. One title, one power center, taken by the people authorized to take it. Evelyn looked at him. You are placing me on leave from the company I built, from the chair position. You know what I meant. Yes. His voice remained calm. And the vote stands. For the first time since I met Evelyn Prescott, I saw something break through her control. Not tears, not panic. Offense. A deep, almost childlike offense that the structures she had spent her life mastering had dared apply themselves to her. She turned toward Avery. This is what you wanted? Avery's face tightened. No. Evelyn waited. Avery said, I wanted the truth. You are allowing strangers to dismantle your family because of documents taken out of context. Dana said, the records were retrieved from your own systems. Evelyn ignored her. Her eyes stayed on Avery. I protected your future. You monitored it. I made sure you were not destroyed by bad luck. You made sure I felt alone while you did it. Evelyn's mouth tightened. You were never alone. Avery laughed once, a small, incredulous sound. That is exactly the problem. Evelyn stared at her. Avery continued. If you were there, then every time I thought nobody knew I was scared, you knew. My skin went cold. If you were there, every time Mom thought we were barely making it, you knew. Evelyn's face hardened. And I intervened when it mattered. Avery shook her head. You don't get to decide that anymore. Silence. Then a man 2 seats down from Andrew raised his hand slightly. I recognized him as one of Evelyn's nephews. Dana. She turned. He looked uncomfortable. Is there a file on me? The room changed. Martin's eyes went to the floor. Dana did not answer immediately. Outside counsel said, the master index contains multiple candidate files. We are not discussing individual records outside authorized review. The man swallowed. That means yes. No one corrected him. Another younger family member looked toward Evelyn. Then another. The question spread without words. Was I tested too? Was that job loss random? Was that scholarship random? Was that relationship failure really mine? Evelyn looked around the room and seemed, for the first time, to understand what the file system had cost her. Not legally, relationally. She had spent decades making people uncertain whether their own lives belonged to them. Now they were all looking at her with the same doubt. The doubt she had taught Avery to live with. Poetic justice did not arrive with sirens. It arrived as suspicion. Her own family no longer trusted the boundary between her love and her control. Outside counsel said the full forensic review would continue through family office expenses, vendor records, privacy practices, and any reimbursement required for personal use of institutional resources. Any actual legal violation would go through the appropriate channel. Nobody promised a criminal case the evidence did not support. Evelyn's immediate loss was narrower, and, for her, more exact. The trustee removed her from Avery's succession review and suspended her discretionary candidate, development authority, while the Prescott Holdings Special Committee separately placed her on leave from the chair position. Her wealth and ownership did not vanish. Her unquestioned right to direct everyone else did. The meeting broke nearly 2 hours later. People moved through the hall in small groups, speaking in low voices. I stood near the drawing room window while Avery signed a document with outside counsel. Not a trust renunciation. Not an inheritance waiver. A formal declination of the conditional property gift. The deed had never transferred. The house remained Evelyn's. Avery also signed consent allowing independent counsel to use records directly related to her candidate file in the investigation. She requested that any future family governance participation require explicit privacy and data use protections. Simple. Specific. No magical document stripping Evelyn of an empire. Just Avery deciding what she would and would not accept. My own attorney placed a settlement release in front of me. The mortgage payoff offer remained available. Caregiving recognition payment. Confidential release. I read the first page, then closed it. No. My attorney nodded. She had expected that. Evelyn approached before we left. She had recovered her composure. Mostly. The keys Avery had returned were in her hand. I can transfer the house without the succession condition. Avery looked at her. Why? Because it should have been yours. No. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the keys. It is a gift. Then why now? Evelyn stared at her. Avery did not wait for an answer. That is why. She turned to leave. Evelyn said, Avery. My daughter stopped. You are still a named beneficiary. None of today changes that. I know. You have responsibilities whether you like them or not. Avery turned back. Maybe. She glanced toward the closed governance room doors. But now I know responsibility doesn't mean obedience. Evelyn's face went still. Avery walked away. I followed. Not beside her immediately. A few steps behind. I wanted to give her room to choose the pace. We were halfway through the front hall when Kimberly came after us. Avery. My daughter kept walking. Avery, please. The desperation in Kimberly's voice made my stomach tighten. She moved faster, heels clicking hard on the floor. Avery, you can't leave like this. Avery stopped near the front doors. I stopped behind her. Kimberly caught up, breathing hard. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath one eye. For once, she did not look polished. She looked like my little sister, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the one I had spent half my life rescuing. That memory tried to pull me toward her. I stayed where I was. Kimberly looked at Avery. I know you're angry. Avery said nothing. I know I made mistakes. Still, nothing. Kimberly's voice shook. But you can't let today erase the fact that I'm your mother. Avery's shoulders tightened. Kimberly stepped closer. You can't erase blood. I saw Avery's hand close slowly at her side. My whole body wanted to move. To protect, to interrupt, to make the sentence easier for her. I did not. This answer did not belong to me. Kimberly's eyes filled. You can't erase that I'm her mother. Avery stopped completely. For a long second, she faced the front doors. Then she turned around. Avery turned around. Kimberly stopped speaking. For a few seconds, the front hall of the Prescott estate seemed to hold its breath with us. Sunlight poured through the tall glass beside the doors and laid a bright rectangle across the floor between mother and daughter. Kimberly stood on one side of it. Avery stood on the other. I stayed where I was. Every instinct I had spent 18 years sharpening told me to step closer. I did not. Avery looked at Kimberly for a long time. Then she said, You're right. Kimberly's face changed so quickly it hurt to watch. Hope rose first. Tiny. Immediate. Avery continued. You are my biological mother. The hope faltered. That is a fact. I'm not erasing it. Kimberly swallowed. But being my mother was never just a fact to me. Her voice did not shake. Mine would have. When I was little, I thought if I behaved better, you'd come back. When I got older, I thought maybe if I stopped needing you, it wouldn't hurt that you didn't. Kimberly's mouth opened. Avery lifted one hand. No, please let me finish. My sister closed her mouth. Avery took a breath. You keep telling yourself I was better off with Mom. She pointed back toward me without looking. And I was. Kimberly flinched. But that doesn't turn leaving into a gift. The sentence landed softly. That made it worse. You don't get to call what you did a sacrifice because someone else loved me well after you left. Kimberly's eyes filled. I was scared. I believe you. I was young. I believe that too. I thought I would come back. Avery nodded. Maybe you did. For the first time, something in Kimberly's face loosened. Then Avery said, But you didn't. Kimberly looked down. Avery waited until she looked up again. If you ever want a relationship with me, you have to stop asking me to make the past easier for you. My throat tightened. That was the sentence I had never known how to say to my own sister. Kimberly whispered, What does that mean? It means no more saying you left because it was best for me. No more telling people you gave me to Mom because you knew she was better. No more talking about those years like they were something noble. Kimberly's face crumpled. And what am I supposed to say? Avery held her gaze. The truth. Silence. Then Kimberly asked, And if I do? Avery's jaw tightened. Then maybe someday I read your letters. The word maybe hit my sister hard. I saw it. But Avery was not finished. You don't get to skip from regret to forgiveness. Kimberly wiped under one eye with the side of her finger. Can I hug you? Avery's face went still. No. Kimberly nodded. Barely. She stepped back. And for once, I did not go to her. I did not put my arm around my sister. I did not tell her Avery was just hurt, that time would help, that maybe things would change. Kimberly had spent years living inside cushions other people placed under her mistakes. I let the floor stay hard. Avery opened the front door. We walked out together. The aftermath did not happen quickly. Real consequences required calendars, interviews, accounting records, and votes. Over the next 4 months, the family office remained under interim leadership, while the Prescott Holdings Special Committee reviewed vendor work, and the trustee kept the candidate files under legal hold. The final report did not turn Evelyn into a cartoon criminal. It documented something more damaging to a woman who had built her identity around judgment. Years of undisclosed candidate, development work, personal family projects supported through institutional resources, weak consent practices, and vendor costs that in some cases had to be reimbursed. Prescott Holdings Board did not return Evelyn to the chair position. She kept her shares, wealth, and family status, but lost control of the candidate development structure and the authority to treat the family office as an extension of her private philosophy. New rules required explicit consent, defined data use, independent oversight, and disclosure of educational assistance. Several younger Prescotts requested their own files, and some paused mentorship programs until they understood what had been collected about them. Evelyn had spent years teaching people to distrust comfort. Now her family distrusted the boundary between her care and her control. Kimberly's consequences were quieter. Her husband and son learned more of the history, and she stopped describing Avery as the daughter I had to let go. At Thanksgiving, a cousin heard her correct herself. The daughter I left. Andrew cooperated, lost his family governance role, and saw his path upward at Prescott Holdings stall. He began sending Avery letters without demanding answers. In January, she finally read one and told me the only line that mattered. I had choices, and I chose myself. She did not reply yet, and I did not ask her to. The house in Greenwich came up again in February. Evelyn's attorney sent Avery a formal letter offering to transfer the property without a succession condition. No required family role. No governance participation. No residency requirement. On paper, it was clean. Avery called me from work after Evelyn's attorney offered to transfer the house without a succession condition. You're not going to tell me what to do? She asked. I was standing in a grocery aisle holding 2 jars of pasta sauce. My current authority extends to marinara. She laughed, then decided she wanted to see the property once more before answering. We returned the following week. Avery walked through the house alone while I stayed in the kitchen, resisting the old urge to follow her face for clues. The first time I had stood there, $5 million of stone and glass had made my small Milford house feel inadequate. Now I could admit that money, security, and opportunity mattered without pretending they could retroactively turn absence into parenting. When Avery came downstairs, she ran a hand over the island. "I don't want it." She explained that every room made her feel as if she were supposed to become the version of herself the house had been built to reward. She might accept trust resources someday. She might join the family council. She would not reject everything Prescott merely to prove loyalty to me. I told her I did not want her to. The attorney brought the declination form. Avery signed it, and the keys stayed on the counter. On the drive home, we stopped for burgers. That felt like the correct level of ceremony. Kimberly came to my house in March. She did not warn me. That used to be enough to make me angry. This time, when I saw her through the window, standing on the porch with a paper grocery bag in her arms, I mostly felt tired. I opened the door, but did not move aside. "What are you doing here?" "I brought your coffee." I looked at the bag. "You drove 90 minutes with coffee? And banana bread. Is this an apology or a hostage negotiation?" Her mouth twitched. For half a second, she looked like my sister before everything became complicated. Then her eyes dropped. "I wanted to talk." "About Avery?" "Yes. She's at work." "I know." That made me look at her. I checked before I came. At least she had learned one boundary. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. We sat on the porch. Kimberly handed me a coffee. I took it. Not forgiveness. Coffee. She stared at the street. I wrote her 3 letters. "I know." She hasn't answered. "I know." How long do I keep writing? The old question. "Tell me what to do, Laura." "Fix it." I held the coffee between my hands. "I don't know." Kimberly looked frustrated. "You always know." "No, I usually decide." "What's the difference?" "A lot, apparently." She looked away. Her voice dropped. "I don't know how to do this if nobody tells me what the right thing is." Something in me hurt, because for the first time, she sounded less like a manipulator and more like someone who had spent so long avoiding responsibility that responsibility itself felt like a foreign language. "You tell the truth," I said. "I have." "Then keep telling it." "And if she never forgives me?" I looked at her. "Then you live truthfully anyway." Tears filled her eyes. "That's it?" "That's it." "What about family?" I almost laughed. Not cruelly, just from exhaustion. "Family is not a coupon, Kim." Her mouth tightened. "You don't get a discount on consequences because we share parents." She looked down at the coffee in her hands. "I miss you too." That one landed where I was not ready. My throat tightened. For years I had defined Kimberly by what she did to Avery. I had forgotten there had been another loss. Mine. A sister I loved and stopped trusting. "I miss who we were," I said. She nodded. "Can we ever get that back?" "No." Her face crumpled. I continued before she could misunderstand. "We can maybe build something else, but I'm not going backward." Kimberly wiped her cheek. "Okay." She stayed for 20 minutes, then left. I did not invite her inside. I also did not hate her when she drove away. Both things could be true. Andrew's first visit happened in April. Avery asked me to be home but not in the room. So I spent 45 minutes upstairs, reorganizing a linen closet that did not need it. When he left, she found me surrounded by perfectly stacked sheets and said the meeting had been bad, but sad bad. He had apologized without explaining, and she had told him that any future contact would happen on her schedule. She was not calling him Dad because he had finally shown up a few times. I managed, with visible effort, not to celebrate. Evelyn did not visit. She sent a handwritten letter apologizing for secrecy and control, then undercut herself by writing that hardship had still contributed to Avery's strength. Avery answered once, "I am not asking you to pretend I am weak. I am asking you to admit you hurt me without explaining why the hurt was useful. Until you can do that, I don't want personal contact. It was not a public punishment or dramatic cutoff. It was a boundary." Spring came, then summer. The first anniversary of Avery's graduation arrived quietly. By then, she had spent nearly a year at the engineering firm. She complained about permit reviews, bad coffee, and contractors who submitted photographs with fingers covering half the lens. She also joined the restructured Prescott Family Beneficiary Council, limited advisory seat, no executive power, no company title. She almost refused because she thought accepting anything from the Prescott system might betray me. That conversation happened over pizza. "I think I want to do it," she said. "Then do it." She stared at me. "That easy?" "No, but that's simple. What if Evelyn thinks she won?" "Evelyn is 75 years old. She can think whatever she wants in her own house." Avery smiled. "I want the privacy rules." "Good. I want younger beneficiaries to know what records exist on them." "Good. I want support to be transparent." "Good." She narrowed her eyes. "Are you going to say anything except good?" "I have notes on the pizza." "That got me a napkin thrown at my head." Avery joined. The first policy she helped pass required consent for personal data collection, disclosure of educational assistance, clear purposes for beneficiary development programs, and an independent complaint channel. It was not glamorous. That was why it mattered. A system did not become humane because one good person replaced one bad decision-maker. It became safer when the rules made private control harder. Late that summer, Avery came to my house on a Friday evening, carrying the old purple backpack. I had not seen it since the night I sat on my bedroom floor with it after the email. She dropped it on the kitchen table. "I found this in the closet." "I know what it is. It is a crime against design. It has character. It has mold. Adjacent energy. It does not have mold." She unzipped it. The zipper caught at the same corner. She pulled harder. It opened. Inside was the old laminated tag. Avery Prescott, 4 years old, a name from before she became Avery Mitchell. She held it between 2 fingers. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I saw the memories pass through her face without knowing which ones they were. The bedroom floor. Sneakers. Waiting. Maybe none of them. Maybe all. She looked at me. "Did I really sleep with this by the door?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Months." Her eyes dropped to the bag. "I thought she was coming." "Yes." "And you knew she probably wasn't," I swallowed. "Yes. That must have been awful. I almost said for you. Then I realized she meant for me. The person who had to answer the question every night." My throat tightened. "It was." Avery traced the old name tag with her thumb. Then she put it back inside. But she did not zip the bag. She left it open, empty. The next morning, we were leaving for a weekend in Rhode Island. Nothing dramatic. 2 nights by the water. Seafood. A bookstore Avery had been talking about for months. I carried my bag to the car and found her standing in the kitchen looking annoyed. "What?" "I forgot my charger." I stared at her. Avery Mitchell did not forget chargers. Avery packed backup chargers. She once carried a power bank to a picnic. "Do you want to go back upstairs?" She shrugged. "I'll buy one there." The sentence was so ordinary that anybody else would have missed it. I did not. For most people, forgetting a charger meant $20 at a drugstore. For Avery, it meant something else. A tiny crack in the lifelong belief that preparedness was the price of safety. She could forget something. She could arrive somewhere incomplete. The world would not punish her for it. Nobody would leave because she had failed to anticipate every problem. I smiled. What? Nothing. That face is not nothing. I'm proud of your irresponsible behavior. Please never say that again. We walked outside. Avery locked the door behind us. Not checked twice. Once. The old backpack stayed on the shelf inside. Open. For 18 years, I had thought my job was to teach Avery that I would stay. In the end, she taught me something too. Staying was not enough if you made someone earn the right to keep you there. Love was not endurance measured by how much pain a person could survive. It was not blood. It was not money. It was not a trust document, a surname, a $5 million house, or a carefully designed test of character. A child should never have to become useful, exceptional, obedient, easy, or unbreakable to deserve a place in someone's life. Avery had spent years proving she was worthy of being chosen. The truth was simpler. She had been worthy before any of us made a choice at all. As we pulled away from the house, she turned up the radio and put her feet on the dashboard. I told her to take them down. She ignored me. I told her again. She laughed. And I laughed too. Home was never the place that finally invited her in. It was the place that never made her earn the right to stay.